Hey guys, tonight we begin with what daily life was really like in ancient Rome. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. Life in ancient Rome was at once ordinary and extraordinary, a rhythm of daily routines that unfolded beneath the weight of empire. To step into the heart of Rome, or into one of its bustling provincial towns, was to enter a world where the familiar and the foreign intertwined, where the simple tasks of rising with the dawn, preparing meals, tending to family, and earning a living were set against the grand backdrop of marble temples, busy forums, and the constant hum of politics, power, and spectacle. Yet for most Romans, daily life was not dominated by emperors or wars, but by the quiet persistence of ordinary survival. To understand Rome, not through its generals or senators, but through the eyes of the men, women, and children who walked its streets, is to uncover a more intimate truth about what it meant to live in the shadow of empire. Morning in Rome often began before the sun had fully risen, with the air still heavy and cool, carrying the faint scent of smoke from braziers and hearths kept alight through the night. The city stirred early. Bakers had already been awake for hours, tending their ovens, preparing bread that would soon fill the counters of shops and the baskets of street sellers. The smell of baking loaves drifted through narrow alleys, mingling with the sharper temps of olive oil and the faint brine of fish left over from yesterday's market. In insolent, towering apartment buildings that housed much of Rome's population, families stirred awake to the creak of wooden stairs, the muffled sound of footsteps above, and the shouts of vendors already calling out their goods from the streets below. For the wealthier families, mornings began in calmer fashion within the enclosed spaces of the domos. These were houses of marble and painted plaster, arranged around open courtyards and shaded gardens. Servants were often the first to rise, drawing water, preparing small meals, and ensuring that the household's routines would begin without interruption. Children, if they were of age, might be roused for lessons with tutors, their days shaped by the recitation of Greek poetry, the memorization of laws, or the study of rhetoric and mathematics. In these households, the hum of learning and the clatter of domestic activity replaced the noisy chaos of the insulae. Yet in both settings, whether in crowded apartments or in spacious homes, mornings held a sense of motion and expectation, as though the city itself demanded that all awaken and join the flow of life. The streets of Rome were never silent. From the earliest hours, they throbbed with activity. Merchants set up stalls, craftsmen opened their workshops, and laborersmen whose hands were hardened by stone, wood, or iron gathered at meeting points, hoping to be hired for the day. Rome's economy thrived on the presence of this casual labor force. Men offered themselves as porters, builders, or general helpers, waiting for the nod of a contractor or overseer. For many, a single day's wage determined whether there would be food on the table that evening. These men jostled for opportunity in open forums and at construction sites, knowing that fortune could be fickle. Rome's grandeur, its towering monuments and sprawling aqueducts, was built not only by imperial decree, but by the sweat of countless anonymous workers who sought to earn their keep with hammer and chisel, rope and cart. Amid the bustle, The sounds of animals were never far away. Donkeys brayed under heavy loads. Oxen pulled carts across uneven cobblestones, and chickens darted between feet in crowded alleys. The marketplace was alive with noise and movement. The clink of coin, the sharp calls of vendors selling figs or olives, the rhythmic pounding of grain being milled into flour. Shoppers, mostly women or household slaves sent by their masters, haggled over prices, testing the firmness of fruits, sniffing cuts of meat, or running their fingers along the smooth surfaces of pottery. The Forum was not just a political center, but a commercial one, its edges lined with stalls and shops. Trade was not confined to local produce. Either Roman markets displayed goods from across the empire. One might find Egyptian linen, Greek wine, Syrian glassware, or African ivory, all displayed side by side, a testament to the vast reach of Rome's dominion. Yet alongside these luxuries, the essentials of life remained constant. Bread, oil, wine, and pulses formed the foundation of the Roman diet, the staples without which no family could manage. As the day advanced, the rhythms of work varied widely depending on one's station in life. For the poor, labor was relentless and A mason spent his day chipping stone, a potter shaping clay, a blacksmith hammering iron. The heat of Roman summers made such work exhausting, and many endured it under the open sun. In contrast, members of the elite lived according to schedules filled with obligations that were less physical but equally demanding. Senators and equestrians conducted business, attended meetings, or participated in legal proceedings. Patronage was central to Roman society. Wealthy patrons met their clients each morning in rituals of loyalty and obligation, offering small stipends or assistance in exchange for political support. These gatherings, known as were part of the intricate web of relationships that bound Roman society together, ensuring that influence and power were distributed according to networks of favor rather than by merit. Alone, that religion infused daily life as well, often in ways that seem quiet and habitual rather than dramatic. Household shrines, or laurea, were tended with offerings of food and wine to household gods, ensuring their protection over family and home. In the streets and in public squares, small altars and statues reminded passers-by of the gods' constant presence. Festivals punctuated the calendar, bringing moments of celebration and collective identity. Sacrifices in temples might seem distant and ceremonial, but the gods were also present in the everyday thanked when a journey went well, invoked before meals, or remembered at crossroads where offerings were left. This ever-present religiosity was less about dogma and more about practice, a web of rituals that sustained the sense of cosmic order upon which Romans believed their prosperity depended. Children's lives were shaped by family expectations and by the class into which they were born. For wealthier boys, education was rigorous, meant to prepare them for public life. Girls were often taught domestic skills, preparing them for marriage and the management of households. Among poorer families, children contributed to work at young ages, carrying water, tending animals, or assisting in trades. Play, when it occurred, was simple yet spirited. Games with knuckle bones, small bowls, or improvised toys gave brief respite from the demands of survival. Life was never without hardship, but even in Rome, laughter and play threaded their way into the fabric of childhood. Echoing through narrow alleys and open courtyards, the midday meal was modest, often consisting of bread, cheese, fruit, and perhaps some olives or vegetables. For the wealthy, The main meal, the center, would come later in the day and be an elaborate affair. But for the majority of Romans, food was functional rather than luxurious. Bread dipped in oil, lentil stew, or porridge made from barley-filled stomachs, sustaining bodies for the labor ahead. Water, often drawn from public fountains supplied by Rome's aqueducts, was the common drink, though diluted wine was also widely consumed. Meals were social moments, however simple, drawing family or neighbors together. Eating was not merely about nourishment, but about sharing in the communal rhythm of life. As the day progressed into afternoon, the city's pace shifted. Shadows lengthened across temples and baths, and people sought respite from the heat. The public baths were central to Roman daily life, serving not only as places for washing, but as hubs of social interaction. Men and women frequented them at different times, and there were spaces where the boundaries between class could momentarily blur. For a small fee, one could enjoy hot, warm, and cold baths, massage, exercise, and conversation. Business deals were struck in these steamy chambers, friendships forged, and gossip exchanged. For many, the baths offered a rhythm of relaxation and connection that punctuated the otherwise relentless march of work and duty. Evenings in Rome were a blend of quiet domesticity and public entertainment. In homes, families gathered for meals that, if modest, carried the weight of tradition and togetherness. In the larger domus of the elite, banquets stretched long into the night, filled with multiple courses, conversation, and performances. Reclining on couches, hosts and guests savored dishes that showcased the empire's bounty. From stuffed dormice to honey-glazed fruits, music, poetry, and dance accompanied the food, turning meals into spectacles of wealth and status. Meanwhile, in more modest settings, families ate simply and retired early. Their bodies weary from the day's labor, public entertainment remained a constant draw. Theaters staged plays, both comedic and tragic, while amphitheaters offered gladiatorial combat or animal hunts. These spectacles reflected the Roman appetite for drama and violence, a reminder that the empire's prosperity was underpinned not only by order but also by the public display of power. For many Romans, however, entertainment came from the streets themselves. Acrobats, jugglers, and storytellers performed for coins, their talents brightening the lives of those who had little to spare. If the mornings of Rome carried the energy of awakening, its midday and afternoons revealed more subtle details of how Romans lived, worked, and expressed themselves. To walk through a neighborhood in the midday hours was to encounter not only the public face of the city, but also the private threads that held its people together. Every stone, every smell, every voice seemed to tell part of the story of how ordinary life unfolded in a place that held the weight of empire on its shoulders. In homes across the city, food preparation was one of the central labors of daily life. Though its form differed sharply depending on wealth and status. In poorer insulae, families cooked over small braziers, their rooms filling with the smoky tang of charcoal. The meals were plain and practical. Grains were boiled into porridge, lentils simmered into thick stews, and vegetables stewed with garlic, onions, and herbs gathered from the edges of markets. Bread was nearly always present, its crusts broken into bowls of broth or dipped in oil to soften their chew. For protein, beans were relied upon, though on rare occasions fish or salted meat might be added when money stretched further. The aroma of such food was earthy, filling but rarely indulgent. In wealthier demots, kitchens were larger, staffed by enslaved cooks who had often been trained to prepare more elaborate dishes. Clay ovens radiated heat as meats roasted, vegetables sizzled, and sauces simmered with spices imported from across the Mediterranean. Honey, garama, pungent fermented fish, sauce and herbs were added generously, creating flavors both rich and layered. Here, food was not simply sustenance, but also display, a way for families to show refinement and wealth. Guests arriving later in the day would be offered dishes meant to astonish and for these households. Cuisine was part of their public identity, yet in both rich and poor households, the preparation of food fell primarily to women and enslaved laborers. Women managed the rhythms of the household, fetching water from public fountains, grinding grain on heavy stone mills, stirring pots, and tending to children all at once. These domestic labors consumed much of their days, a reality far removed from the marble statues and mosaics that celebrated idealized Roman womanhood. Their hands bore the marks of labor, their backs carried the weight of work. And though history remembers emperors, it was these women who sustained daily life through sheer persistence. Clothing, too, carried meaning beyond the fabric itself. For most Romans, garments were simple and practical. The tunic, usually wool, sometimes linen, was the basic item worn by men, women, and children alike. Dyed tunics might signal modest prosperity, but most were undyed, bearing the plain color of the cloth itself. For warmth, cloaks were fastened with brooches, and sandals carried feet through streets paved unevenly with stone. For the elite, clothing carried deeper symbolism. Senators wore tunics edged with a broad purple stripe, while equestrians bore narrower bands, the dye announcing rank to any observer. Women of wealth wrapped themselves in stolas, long garments draped elegantly, often in vibrant colors. Jewelry of gold, silver, or bronze adorned their ears and wrists, signaling not only wealth but family pride. Even the simplest pin or clasp could carry meaning, showing one's place in the vast hierarchy of Roman society. Laundry was a task so essential and yet so curious that it became one of Rome's more unusual trades. Clothes were cleaned not at home but in public. Phalanike, run by professional launderers. These workers soaked garments in tubs of water mixed with fuller's earth and, most strangely to modern sensibilities, urine collected from public jars. The ammonia helped bleach and clean the fabrics. Workers would stomp on the garments with their feet, rinse them, and hang them in the sun to dry. To pass one of these workshops was to encounter the acrid sting of ammonia in the air, an unavoidable reminder of the labor required to maintain even the simplest garments. It was a reminder, too, that the city thrived on the hidden, often unpleasant, work of countless individuals whose names are lost to time. The architecture of daily life varied as much as the clothing. Insulae housed the majority of Rome's citizens, towering structures of brick and wood that reached multiple stories into the air. The wealthier occupied the lower floors, with larger rooms and easier access to water and sanitation, while the poor lived in cramped upper levels, climbing narrow staircases and carrying water up by hand. Fires were constant threats in these tightly packed structures, and collapse was not uncommon, as landlords built higher and cheaper to maximize rent. Yet despite the risks, these insulae buzzed with life. Neighbors knew each other closely, walls were thin, and daily routines overlapped in a constant, noisy exchange. It was a form of community, though one born of necessity rather than luxury. In contrast, the domus of the elite stood as self-contained worlds, built around an atrium with open skylights admitting light and air, These houses combined practicality with grandeur. Mosaics decorated floors, frescoes brightened walls with scenes of myth or landscape, and gardens provided spaces of quiet escape. The domus was both home and stage, a place where wealth was displayed to visitors and clients. The careful arrangement of rooms, from public reception spaces to private quarters, reflected the layered structure of Roman society itself, where public identity and private life were always intertwined. Children's voices added texture to this daily life. In poorer neighborhoods, they played in alleys with clay dolls, wooden hoops, and knucklebones, improvising joy from whatever scraps they could find. They chased one another past vendors, splashed water at fountains, and learned the sounds and sights of their world through play. Education, when it came, was shaped by family fortune. Wealthier boys studied under grammarians, learning Greek and Latin literature, while poorer children learned skills through apprenticeship or simple repetition of household labor. Girls, regardless of class, were more often directed toward preparation for marriage, though in some families, daughters were educated alongside sons. The laughter, cries, and arguments of children filled every neighborhood, carrying the promise of generations who would inherit the burdens and the glories of Rome. As the afternoon wore on, the city's pulse slowed slightly. The heat of summer pressed heavily on streets, driving many indoors. Merchants closed shutters, laborers sought shade, and even animals seemed to pause in their movements. But Rome never entirely slept during the day. In forums, legal proceedings continued, the voices of advocates rising in rhetorical flourish. In workshops, artisans bent over their tools, shaping metal, clay, or leather. In quieter corners, scribes and record keepers documented transactions, their careful hands leaving behind records that centuries later still whisper the details of Roman life. The hum of commerce, governance, and labor never truly ceased. For women, the afternoon often meant continuation of domestic duties, spinning wool, weaving cloths, supervising slaves, or preparing for evening meals. These tasks may have seemed repetitive, yet they sustained the entire fabric of society. Clothing, food, and family care all flowed from these quiet labors. In wealthier households, women might also engage in social visits, attending to friends, exchanging news, or participating in religious observances at neighborhood shrines. Religion was woven into every layer of life, and women's role as guardians of household piety was deeply respected, even as their legal rights remained restricted. To pour a libation at the household shrine, to place a garland upon the roof, was not simply ritual but affirmation of belonging, a connection between family and divine order. Food remained at the heart of daily rhythm, and as evening approached, preparations for the cena began. Among the poor, this was a modest affair: stews of beans and grains, bread broken among family members, perhaps enlivened with herbs or a scrap of meat if fortune allowed. Wine was diluted with water, shared among all, though its strength was far from the robust wines celebrated in poetry. Yet, even in these humble meals, there was togetherness. Family gathered close, neighbors might share a pot, and the act of eating became a reaffirmation of survival. Among the wealthy, cena was spectacle. Guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables, their bodies supported by cushions, while servants carried in trays of food. Multiple courses unfolded: appetizers of eggs and olives, main dishes of roasted meats, seafood, or exotic delicacies, followed by fruits, nuts, and sweetened pastries. Honey was poured over dishes, Pepper added to unexpected places, flavors mixed in surprising combinations. Conversation flowed with the wine, and entertainment often accompanied the meal, musicians strumming lyres, poets reciting verses, dancers moving with measured grace. For hosts, these meals were as much about politics as about pleasure, opportunities to impress allies, reinforce bonds, and display the reach of their wealth. Yet even in these luxurious gatherings, one saw echoes of the same ritual that bound poorer households. The sharing of food as a central act of Roman life. Evenings stretched on, the city softening into a quieter hum, though never silent. Lamps flickered along streets, casting small circles of light into the shadows. Storytellers and performers sometimes gathered small crowds, filling the air with laughter or awe. In theaters, audiences gathered for comedies and tragedies, their reactions loud, unrestrained, part of the communal experience. If mornings were for rising and afternoons for tending to domestic duties, the Roman day was equally defined by its ceaseless work. At nearly every corner of the empire's capital, one could hear the clang of hammers, the rasp of saws, and the chatter of voices engaged in trade. Rome was not merely a city of marble and politics. It was a living machine of labor, powered by the hands of millions who carved, stitched, hauled, and built to keep the great organism alive. To walk along the narrow lanes of a working district was to step into a cacophony of craftsmanship. Blacksmiths hunched over glowing forges, sparks leaping as hammers struck iron into nails, tools, and hinges. The scent of hot metal mixed with the heavy temps of sweat, as apprentices worked bellows and masters guided their craft with practiced precision. Carpenters shaped wood into stools, doors, wagons, and beams, their chisels singing against the grain. Leather workers softened hides in pungent vats, stretching them into sandals or belts. Each craft had its guild, a brotherhood of laborers who maintained standards, defended their members, and passed skills from generation to generation. These guilds were lifelines, providing funerary funds, mutual aid, and a sense of belonging in a city that could otherwise reduce men to nameless cogs in its machinery. Yet not all labor was free. The great majority of Rome's hardest work fell upon the shoulders of slaves, whose lives varied wildly depending on the circumstances of their servitude. Some, skilled in letters or craft, worked as tutors, accountants, or artisans, their positions granting a measure of comfort, though never true freedom. Others labored in kitchens, fields, or workshops, their days filled with repetitive, back-breaking tasks. The harshest fate fell upon those sent to mines and quarries, where darkness, dust, and exhaustion shortened lives to years rather than decades. Slavery in Rome was vast, a silent engine driving agriculture, industry, and domestic luxury. For many Roman households, the line between comfort and survival rested on the unpaid toil of those bound in chains. Despite the cruelty of the system, pathways toward freedom existed. Manumission, the granting of liberty, was a common practice. Whether through a master's goodwill, a slave's savings, or testamentary will, freedmen carried both stigma and pride, bearing the mark of their past, but also the opportunities of citizenship. Many rose to wealth through trade, running taverns, workshops, or businesses with the tenacity born of struggle. Some freedmen achieved astonishing success, their names recorded in inscriptions praising their generosity or their service to the city. In their journeys, one glimpses the complex fabric of Roman society, where status could shift and fortune could be remade, though never easily. Food and craft sustained the city, but entertainment gave it soul. The Romans, for all their discipline and pragmatism, were a people deeply devoted to spectacle. Theaters and amphitheaters pulsed with crowds, their laughter, shouts, and gasps carrying into the night. In the stone curves of the theater, comedies of Plautus and Terence continued to echo, with actors donning masks to exaggerate character and movement. The humor was broad, the gestures large, but the themes spoke to daily struggles. Clever slaves outwitting masters, misers guarding coins, lovers deceiving parents. These plays, though written centuries earlier, resonated because they mirrored the tensions of everyday life. The amphitheater offered something darker. Gladiatorial combat, staged amid roaring crowds, was more than blood sport. It was a performance of power. Men, sometimes criminals, sometimes prisoners of war, sometimes volunteers, fought with swords, tridents, or nets, their bodies trained into living weapons. The sand ran red, yet the crowd exulted, for in these struggles they saw both fear and courage magnified. To witness victory was to celebrate Roman valor. To see death was to affirm the empire's dominance over flesh and fate. For the common citizen, these games were not merely distraction, but ritual, binding society together through shared awe and terror. Chariot racing in the circus, Maximus stirred passions even fiercer. Teams of horses thundered around the track, their hooves pounding against stone. Drivers leaning dangerously as chariots tilted on sharp turns. The factions' reds, blues, greens, and whites commanded loyalty that transcended sport, dividing neighborhoods, sparking rivalries, even influencing politics. The noise of 100,000 voices filled the air as banners waved and wagers were shouted. In these races, the collective pulse of Rome beat loudest. Its people united not by law or duty, but by the thrill of speed and chance. Beneath these spectacles lay the quieter forms of leisure that shaped Roman evenings. Taverns buzzed with drinkers, their cups of watered wine clinking as dice rattled across wooden tables. Jokes, arguments, and songs rose into the smoky air, mingling with the scent of grilled meat or roasted chickpeas sold by street vendors outside. Bathhouses offered another refuge, where men and women in separate facilities cleansed themselves, exercised, and gossiped. The rhythm of Rome was not only labor and spectacle, but also rest, conversation, and the simple pleasure of shared company. For the poor, leisure was simpler, but no less vital. Street performers entertained with juggling, acrobatics, or music, drawing coins from passers-by. Children imitated their elders' games, spinning tops or gambling with knuckle bones. Families gathered in doorways, sharing stories, laughter, or simply watching the flow of neighbors and strangers across the streets. Life, even in hardship, carried moments of brightness, and it was these small joys that made survival not merely endurable but meaningful. Religion threaded through every layer of these activities. To begin a day without saluting the household gods was unthinkable, for the Lares and Penates were guardians of hearth and home. Shrines adorned corners of streets, small niches with offerings of garlands, incense, or tiny cakes. Every event, from the opening of a shop to the departure of a ship, required ritual observance. Festivals punctuated the calendar, filling streets with processions, sacrifices, and dances. For Romans, the divine was never distant, but always present, shaping fortune, guiding fate, and binding community. Even in laughter, even in games, there was a sense that gods looked on, their favor or anger determining outcomes. Yet behind the laughter of taverns and the brilliance of spectacles, the struggles of daily survival never vanished. For countless Romans, wages barely covered rent, food, and clothing. Fires in insulae displaced families overnight. Disease swept through crowded districts, and famine occasionally tightened its grip on markets. Even when granaries overflowed, prices could soar, leaving the poor scrambling for scraps of bread. The state distributed free grain to citizens, but lines were long, tempers short, and supplies uneven. To stand in a grain queue was to feel both gratitude for survival and frustration at dependence. Hunger remained an unspoken shadow across the lives of many, never fully absent, always threatening to return. That divide between rich and poor was visible at every step. To pass from the Subura, with its crowded tenements, into the marble-lined Forum was to step between worlds. Yet both worlds were Rome, bound together by trade, politics, and faith. The patrician needed the labor of the plebeian, just as the plebeian depended on the patronage of the elite. This web of interdependence, woven through gifts, obligations, and favors, held the city together. To survive in Rome meant to navigate this web carefully, with humility, wit, or ambition as one's tools. As night deepened, work ceased, and the city settled into its uneasy rest. Some returned from taverns with flushed faces, others from bathhouses with refreshed bodies. Shopkeepers locked shutters, families drew children close, and slaves completed their last tasks before retreating to narrow quarters. Fires flickered in braziers, the glow visible through cracks in shutters. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a chariot driver's song drifted from the circus, mingling with the hushed prayers whispered to the gods of protection. Rome, never silent, seemed to breathe slower, yet the weight of its millions remained heavy upon the stones. Each life was a thread, fragile and essential, woven into the vast tapestry of a city that called itself eternal. If the daily labors and amusements of Rome defined the steady rhythm of life, then the festivals provided the crescendos, the moments when the city seemed to abandon itself to collective joy, chaos, or devotion. The Roman calendar was dense with such celebrations, each tied to gods, myths, or civic memory. To live in Rome was to move not only through streets and markets, but also through an endless cycle of sacred days and public holidays that both reinforced identity and offered respite from toil. Consider the Saturnalia, one of the most famous festivals, held in honor of Saturn, god of agriculture and time. During its days of revelry, social order was deliberately inverted. Masters served meals to their slaves, gambling flourished openly, and the streets rang with laughter, songs, and mockery. Families decorated their homes with greenery, exchanged gifts of candles or small figurines, and gathered for feasts that stretched long into the night. For those who lived under constant discipline or in chains, these few days offered a rare glimpse of liberty, however temporary. The city was transformed, not by marble or politics, but by a shared suspension of its ordinary hierarchies. Other festivals carried different tones. The Lupercalia, with its half-mythic origins, involved priests running through the streets, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide to ensure fertility and good fortune. The Floralia celebrated flowers, fertility, and theatricality, filling the air with color and licentious humor. The Consualia, dedicated to Consus, god of stored grain, tied the rhythms of worship directly to the harvests that fed the people. Each festival revealed something essential about Roman values: reverence for gods, reverence for abundance, and the constant need to blend seriousness with spectacle, The religious life of the city was not limited to grand festivals. Every home contained its lararium, a small shrine where Lares' household guardians and Pinity's protectors of the pantry were honored. The paterfamilias head of the household offered prayers and incense daily, reminding his family that divine presence was woven into even the smallest acts. Births, marriages, and deaths carried their own rituals, binding private lives to cosmic rhythms. To be Roman was to be constantly aware of the unseen forces that guided fortune, health, and fate. But the city did not only bow to its ancient gods. By the imperial era, Rome was a melting pot of faiths, each carried from the provinces and mingling in its neighborhoods. The worship of Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and countless local deities could be found in shrines tucked into alleys or beneath houses. These cults offered mystery, belonging, and often a promise of salvation that the old civic religion did not provide. Rome's spiritual life was both vast and fragmented, each belief competing or coexisting, but together reflecting a population constantly seeking meaning beyond the struggles of survival. Nightfall brought its own transformation. While much of Rome descended into rest, the city after dark carried both allure and danger. Oil lamps flickered in taverns where patrons lingered over their drinks, voices rising in drunken songs or angry disputes. Prostitutes gathered near bathhouses or street corners, calling to passers-by, while gamblers huddled over dice in smoky back rooms. Thieves prowled the alleys, taking advantage of shadows and the thin policing of Rome's watchmen. For the wealthy, dinners extended late, filled with performances of music, poetry, or acrobatics to entertain guests. For the poor, evenings often meant simply gathering with neighbors outside insulae, trading gossip or watching the stars until weariness pulled them to their cramped quarters. Despite the dangers, the city never truly slept. Bakers lit their ovens long before dawn, their silhouettes bending over rising dough, while most of Rome still slumbered. Messengers carried urgent notes for senators or generals. Carters hauled goods through quieter streets, taking advantage of the night to avoid daytime congestion. The balance between work and rest was never equal. Some rose to labor while others indulged in leisure, creating a mosaic of lives that pulsed continuously through the hours. And yet, always, there was fragility. Rome's greatness was unquestioned, but its daily life carried constant risks. Fires sparked by a single unattended lamp could race through wooden beams of insulae, consuming homes and families before the watch could respond. Floods of the Tiber swept away belongings and sometimes lives, disrupting markets and spreading disease. Epidemics struck without warning, thinning the streets of their bustle. Even in times of apparent abundance, scarcity loomed at the edges, threatening to return with failed harvests, poor distribution, or corruption in the grain supply. This precariousness shaped the psychology of the Roman crowd. Gratitude for spectacles, for grain distributions, for even the smallest comforts was tempered by the knowledge that security could vanish overnight. It explains why emperors feared the mob's anger as much as they desired its applause, why patronage and charity played such central roles, and why rituals to the gods were so carefully observed. Survival was never guaranteed, and in a city of 1 million, one person's misfortune was a neighbor's warning. Yet for all the hardships, there was resilience. Families endured, friendships flourished, laughter echoed from tenement balconies, and the smell of bread or roasted meats could still draw neighbors together. Children grew, chasing each other through the streets, their voices piercing the din of hammers and carts. Old men recounted stories of wars, migrations, or lost loves, their memories bridging past and present. Life was never easy, but it was rich, textured, and filled with moments of grace. Rome was harsh, but it was also alive, and those who lived within it found ways to carve joy out of scarcity, pride out of labor, and meaning out of ritual. As segment 1 draws to a close, we stand with Rome's ordinary citizens at the end of another day. Their stomachs are filled or left wanting, their hearts lifted by laughter or heavy with worry. They return to beds of straw, pallets, or couches, their dreams shaped by the day's struggles and the ever-present hum of a city too vast to silence. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin again. The clang of forges, the shouts of vendors, the murmurs of prayer, the cheers of spectacle. In their persistence, their endurance, and their adaptability lies the truth of what daily life was really like in ancient Rome. Not a tale of emperors or generals, but of millions whose anonymous lives built the foundations of eternity. If the streets of Rome were the arteries of public life, then the home was its heart, however humble or grand. To understand what daily life was truly like in ancient Rome, one must step past the thresholds of its dwellings, for here the rhythms of intimacy, family, and domestic ritual unfolded in ways just as essential to Roman identity as the roar of the Colosseum or the bustle of the Forum. The contrast between rich and poor was written most vividly in the walls they called their own. For the wealthy, the Domos was both a residence and a performance stage. Entering such a home often meant stepping from a noisy, crowded street into an ordered world designed to impress. The doorway itself might be decorated with carved lintels or bronze fittings, and as you entered the vestibulum, you would be greeted by mosaics beneath your feet, sometimes witty warnings like the famous Cave Canem, a snarling dog worked into stone, reminding visitors to beware. Immediately beyond stretched the atrium, the grand central hall, open to the sky through a rectangular opening, designed to let in light and channel rainwater into the marble pool below, the impluvium. The sound of dripping water, cool and soothing, filled the space, a counterpoint to the dust and clamor outside. For guests, this first impression declared wealth, taste, and lineage. The atrium was more than decoration. It served as the beating heart of the Roman family, a space where ancestors were honored. Niches in the walls displayed wax masks, images of forebears long dead, carried in funeral processions, and now staring down silently upon the living. These were not private mementos, but public assertions of continuity and authority. To enter such a home was to step into a lineage, to feel the weight of time itself pressing forward into the present. From the atrium, one might move into the tablinum, the study or office of the paterfamilias, where family business was conducted, clients received, and accounts managed. Beyond, inner courtyards called peristyles opened into carefully tended gardens, fountains, and colonnades, bringing light and greenery into the heart of the house. Walls were painted with frescoes, landscapes of myth, gods, and illusionistic scenes meant to expand the sense of space. Floors were laid with intricate mosaics depicting geometric patterns, marine life, or heroic tales. Every surface communicated refinement and control, a reminder that leisure and beauty were privileges born from wealth. Meals in such homes could take place in richly appointed triclinia, dining rooms where couches were arranged around tables, allowing guests to recline as they feasted. Painted walls depicted Dionysian revels or banquet scenes. creating a continuity between the decoration and the activity within. Servants brought food, poured wine, adjusted lamps, and played music, while the family enjoyed the spectacle of their own domestic abundance. Here, home life was both intimate and theatrical, a private pleasure designed to be displayed. Yet just a few streets away, life in the insulae told an entirely different story. These apartment blocks, sometimes rising 5 or more stories, housed a majority of Rome's population. Built of brick, wood, and concrete, they were notorious for their instability. Poor construction and overcrowding made them prone to collapse, and fires often swept through them with devastating speed. For the inhabitants, home was less sanctuary and more necessity. A place to sleep after long hours of labor rather than a carefully cultivated refuge. Rooms were small and sparsely furnished, often no more than a single chamber shared by an entire family. Windows were rare, and when present, they let in little light. Walls absorbed the noise of neighbors on every side. From crying infants to heated arguments, from the scraping of stools to the clang of pots. Water was not piped into apartments, so tenants descended to public fountains daily, carrying jars and buckets. Latrines were shared, sometimes little more than communal pits, a source of both stench and disease. Privacy was scarce, and comfort scarcer still. Yet even in these cramped conditions, life found its shape. Families carved out small rituals, mothers tending to cooking on portable braziers, fathers repairing tools or mending shoes after work, children inventing games with scraps of wood or bone. Neighbors forged bonds born of necessity, sharing food, watching one another's children, or pooling resources to buy oil for lamps. The insulae were noisy, messy, often dangerous, but they were also alive with human connection, a resilience that refused to be extinguished by hardship. Between these two extremes, the opulence of the domus and the fragility of the insula, lay a spectrum of Roman homes, modest townhouses of tradesmen, comfortable apartments of the middle classes, villas sprawling in the countryside where wealthy Romans retreated from the chaos of the city. Each reflected not only wealth, but also values. The domos proclaimed lineage and authority. The villa promised leisure and escape. The insula embodied survival, resourcefulness, and the endurance of the majority. The design of homes also revealed Rome's blending of practicality and symbolism. Doors were decorated with phallic symbols, not vulgar to Roman eyes, but protective, warding off evil spirits. Household gods presided from Lareia, small shrines often painted brightly, with images of serpents symbolizing prosperity. Even the poorest insula might have a crude niche carved into plaster for offerings. The Roman home was never only material. It was spiritual, woven with meaning that linked the most ordinary family meal to the vast order of gods and ancestors. Domestic labor shaped daily rhythms. Inside these walls, women managed households, overseeing servants in wealthy homes, or balancing endless tasks themselves in poorer ones. Grinding grain, weaving cloth, preparing food. Children learned their place within the hierarchy early, boys educated in reading and rhetoric if their families could afford it. Girls taught the skills of spinning and household management. Slaves moved silently through halls, invisible yet indispensable, their presence defining the comfort of their masters and the economy of the city alike. Every Roman home, no matter how grand or humble, was structured by this constant labor, and yet, amid all this work and ritual, there was warmth. Families gathered in evenings, telling stories, sharing bread, or listening to elders recount the past. Weddings filled homes with music and laughter. Funerals draped them in mourning, echoing with laments. Children's laughter and cries punctuated the air as surely as the clang of amphorae or the hiss of oil lamps. These small domestic moments, less dramatic than the spectacles of arenas or forums, were the true threads of Roman life, binding generations together in the privacy of walls that, however fragile, offered shelter from the vast, relentless city outside. As we step further into this world, we begin to see how the Roman home, whether palace-like or perilously cramped, was more than a physical structure. It was a mirror of society itself, its inequalities, its values, its struggles, and its joys. To walk through the doors of Rome's homes is to walk directly into the lives of its people. And it is there that the intimate truth of ancient daily life begins to unfold. To understand the soul of a Roman household, one must go beyond its architecture and decoration. The walls may have reflected wealth or poverty, but what truly brought them to life were the people inside. Fathers and mothers, children and elders, servants and slaves, each bound together in a web of duty, expectation, and tradition. If the domos was a physical heart, then the family was its beating rhythm, shaping every hour of the day. At the center of the Roman family stood the pater, the male head of household, who carried not only authority, but also legal and religious responsibility. Roman law granted him nearly absolute power over his family. He could arrange marriages for his children, manage their property, and even, in the early republic, decide questions of life and death. This might suggest a tyrant's rule, but in practice, paternal authority was tempered by custom, affection, and the realities of human bonds. Many Roman fathers were stern, but they were also deeply invested in their children's education, reputation, and future. For their honor lived on through them. Marriage in Rome was less about romantic love than about alliances, stability, and the continuation of family lines. Among elites, unions were carefully arranged to secure political or social advantage. Daughters might be married off young, sometimes in their early teens, while sons were expected to wed later, once their careers were established. For the poor, marriage was less strategic but no less important. It provided stability and legitimacy, and though the ceremonies might be simple, the sense of partnership endured. A wedding was an occasion of festivity, garlands strung, songs sung, and torches carried as the bride was led to her new home, where she crossed the threshold carefully, avoiding ill omens, before being welcomed into her husband's family. For women, marriage was a turning point, but their roles were not confined solely to domestic tasks. Roman women, particularly among the wealthy, wielded influence through their households, managing servants, overseeing finances, and even shaping political alliances from behind the scenes. While they could not vote or hold office, their presence was far from passive. Letters, inscriptions, and poetry reveal women who were strong, witty, sometimes rebellious, often admired. In humbler settings, women labored side by side with their husbands, weaving cloth, selling goods, or assisting in farming. Their contributions were essential, though rarely celebrated in public record. Children, too, were integral to the household rhythm. Infant mortality was tragically high, and the birth of a healthy child was greeted with gratitude and ceremony. A newborn would be laid at the feet of the paterfamilias, who symbolically acknowledged the child into the family. Boys and girls alike wore the bulla, a protective amulet against evil spirits, until they reached maturity. Education was a privilege for the wealthy, where boys studied under tutors or at schools in reading, writing, arithmetic, and rhetoric. Girls often received informal education at home, though some learned enough to read and write letters, manage estates, or compose poetry. For the poor, childhood was shorter. Children often worked early, helping with crafts, chores, or small trades to contribute to the household's survival. Life in the household was marked by rituals of religion, for the family was not only a social unit, but also a sacred one. Daily offerings were made at the lararium, the household shrine, where small statues of Lares and Penates, guardian spirits of family and storeroom, stood watch. A flicker of oil lamps, a pinch of incense, or a libation of wine tied the family to the unseen world. Festivals like Saturnalia or Parentalia brought these private devotions into harmony with the wider rhythms of civic religion, uniting private piety with public celebration. Yet no aspect of family life was more telling of Roman society than the presence of slaves. Enslaved people were everywhere in Roman households, shaping every detail of daily existence. In the grand domus of the wealthy, dozens might serve under one roof. Cooks preparing meals, tutors teaching children, scribes keeping accounts, maids attending to clothing, and porters guarding the entrance. They polished mosaics, stoked braziers, poured wine, and whispered gossip in corners. For their masters, their labor was invisible, expected, constant, and vital. The comfort of Roman domestic life rested squarely upon their shoulders in poorer homes. The presence of even one slave was a sign of modest prosperity. For most, household labor fell on family members themselves, but in the great villas of the countryside, slaves were counted in hundreds, working fields, tending livestock, or managing workshops that produced everything from pottery to textiles. Their lives were harsh and freedom distant, yet the Roman household was also shaped by the possibility of manumission. A slave could be freed, often after years of loyal service, and upon liberation, they became a freedman or freedwoman, tied still to their former master, but granted rights, families, and futures. These freed individuals filled Rome's streets, markets, and trades, living testimonies to both the brutality and permeability of slavery in Roman life. Gender roles, though clearly defined, were not unyielding. Roman writers often idealized women as modest, industrious, and loyal, but reality was more varied. Tomb inscriptions speak of women remembered for their business acumen, their wisdom, or their wit. Some became poets, others patrons of the arts. In poor neighborhoods, women ran stalls, brewed beer, or assisted midwives. They were caretakers and breadwinners alike, their work crucial to survival. Boys were taught to be citizens, soldiers, orators. Girls to be mothers, managers, and companions. Yet the affection recorded in family epitaphs, fathers grieving daughters, mothers praising sons, reveals the emotional heart beneath these societal expectations. Evenings in a Roman household carried a rhythm that tied together these roles. In wealthier homes, families might gather for a cena, the main meal, reclining on couches as dishes arrived in sequence, from appetizers to main courses, accompanied by conversation, entertainment, or poetry readings. In poorer dwellings, the cena was simpler: bread, porridge, lentils, maybe fish or vegetables. Afterward, children played or were tucked into sleep, lamps were trimmed, and prayers whispered at the household shrine. The day ended not with spectacle, but with the quiet intimacy of family, bound together by duty and affection. Yet behind this intimacy lay tensions. Fathers could be harsh, sons rebellious, daughters unwilling brides, mothers caught between affection and duty. Slaves resisted in small ways, slowing their work, hiding tools, whispering secrets. Freedmen navigated their precarious place between gratitude and independence. The Roman household was no static institution. It was alive with negotiation, compromise, and human emotion. Much like households across time, what makes Roman family life compelling is how it combined the ordinary with the extraordinary. Parents worried for their children's futures, just as families do today. Couples argued over finances, meals, or the behavior of relatives. But over all hung the weight of Roman tradition, the sense that every household was a miniature reflection of Rome itself. Ordered, hierarchical, sacred, and enduring. The paterfamilias was a small echo of the Senate's authority. The household shrine, a reflection of Rome's temples. The laughter of children, a promise that Rome's story would continue. Thus, in the quiet of Roman homes, whether in marble atriums or cramped insulae, we find not only domestic details, but the very structure of Roman civilization. The family was Rome's most basic institution, shaping its values, perpetuating its order, and ensuring its survival. To peer into these households is to peer into the living core of the empire. Ordinary lives woven into the extraordinary fabric of history. If the Roman household provided the structure of family life, then the details of food, clothing, and routine filled out its texture. What Romans ate, how they dressed, and the rhythm of their daily hours all revealed the blend of practicality, tradition, and spectacle that shaped their world. The Roman day began not with the dawn, but with the rising of the sun, for light governed all activity. There were no electric lamps to stretch the hours, no alarm clocks to jolt one awake. Only the slow illumination of the sky and the cock's crow to announce the time. For the wealthy, slaves would open shutters, stoke the household hearth, and bring water for washing. For the poor, morning began in the dimness of a cramped insular room where smoke from last night's fire lingered. A splash of cold water on the face, a piece of bread or cheese for strength, and the day was underway. Roman meals were structured into 3 parts: ientaculum, prondium, and cena. The ientaculum, a morning meal, was often light, bread dipped in wine, olives, figs, or perhaps some cheese. Among the wealthy, it might include eggs or honeyed pastries, but it was not considered the most important part of the day. Prondium, the midday meal, was a bit more substantial but still modest. Cold meats left from the night before, vegetables, fruit, and bread. Workers, soldiers, and craftsmen often ate on the go, stopping at thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of street-side snack bars, where hot food could be purchased and eaten quickly. These establishments were scattered throughout the city, with counters of terracotta jars holding stews, lentils, or mulled wine. Archaeological remains from Pompeii reveal murals of food painted on their walls, advertisements for hungry passers-by. The true centerpiece of Roman eating was the cena, the evening meal. For the poor, this was often simple: porridge made from grain, a little salted fish, lentils, or vegetables. For the wealthy, however, cena could stretch into elaborate feasts lasting hours. Guests reclined on couches in the triclinium, arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a low table, attended by slaves carrying trays of dishes in careful order. A proper cena began with gustatio, appetizers such as eggs, olives, or salad. Then came the main courses, roasted meats, fish, or poultry, often seasoned with herbs and drenched in garum, the pungent fish sauce beloved by Romans. Wealthier hosts prided themselves on exotic fair flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with nuts, or rare shellfish. The meal concluded with secundae mensae, desserts of fruit, cakes, or honeyed wine. Conversation and entertainment accompanied every bite. Poetry readings, musicians, jugglers, or even small-scale theatrical performances. Food was nourishment, but also a stage for power, wealth, and cultural sophistication. Wine was omnipresent, though it was never consumed neat. Romans considered drinking unmixed wine a mark of barbarism. Instead, they diluted it with water, sometimes spiced it with honey, pepper, or herbs, and drank it throughout the day. The amount of wine consumed depended on class. The elite could afford finer vintages, while the poor drank harsher blends, sometimes sour or watered to near weakness. But in every home, from the grand villa to the narrow insula, wine was part of the rhythm of meals, a shared taste that bound Romans across social divisions. Clothing in Rome told the world who you were before you spoke a word. At the base of every wardrobe was the tunic, a simple garment worn by men, women, and children alike. For the poor, tunics were made of coarse wool or linen, often belted at the waist, practical for labor. For the wealthy, tunics were finer, sometimes embroidered, dyed in colors like saffron, crimson, or deep purple. Over the tunic, the toga reigned as the symbol of Roman citizenship. Vast, heavy, and difficult to wear. The toga was not an everyday garment for casual errands, but a statement of civic pride. Draped carefully in folds across the body, to wear a toga was to declare one's status, and to master its folds was a skill in itself. Women's clothing revolved around the stola, a long garment that signified respectability and marriage. Paired with the palla, a draped shawl worn over the head or shoulders, it conveyed modesty and dignity. Hairstyles were another marker of identity, especially for elite women, who arranged their hair in intricate curls, braids, or towering constructions, sometimes with jewels woven in. Portrait busts reveal astonishing detail in these fashions, each style signaling not only wealth, but also the influence of current imperial tastes. Men's grooming was equally telling. The clean-shaven look dominated much of Roman history, though in some eras, beards became fashionable. Following the example of philosophers or emperors like Hadrian, footwear ranged from simple sandals to sturdy boots, designed for both the cobbled streets of Rome and the muddy paths of the countryside. Wealthier citizens displayed dyed leather shoes, while laborers wore whatever their trade required. Jewelry adorned women of all classes. Rings, brooches, earrings, and necklaces were treasured not only as decoration, but as portable wealth. Even poor women, if they could, kept a simple trinket or charm. The daily rhythm of a Roman life varied by status, but certain patterns tied them together. For an elite Roman male, the day might begin with clients visiting his home in the salutatio, a formal morning greeting where dependents paid respects and, in return, received small gifts or assistance. From there, he might walk to the forum to conduct legal or political business, attend a Senate session, or visit the baths in the afternoon. A craftsman, by contrast, would begin his labor early, working at carpentry, pottery, or smithing until midday, then pausing for a simple meal before continuing until the light faded. Women's routines revolved around household management, overseeing slaves, preparing food, weaving cloth, caring for children, and ensuring offerings at the family shrine. The public baths were one of the most universal parts of Roman routine. Cutting across class divisions, these were not mere places to wash, but centers of social life, exercise, and leisure. Men and women bathed separately, though sometimes at different hours in the same complex. Visitors moved through a sequence of rooms: the apoditerium changing room, the tepidarium warm room, the caldarium hot bath, and finally the frigidarium cold plunge. They exercised, soaked, and socialized, rubbing their bodies with oil scraped off with Bathhouses were also places of business, gossip, and relaxation, as essential to Roman life as any forum or market. For the poor, the baths provided not just hygiene, but a rare luxury: warm water and public space to unwind. As the day drew on, the rhythms converged at the household scene, where food, family, and ritual closed the cycle. Lamps were lit, prayers offered at the shrine, and stories told. In the wealthier homes, entertainment might extend the night into feasting and music. But even in the humblest homes, the day ended with shared bread, a cup of diluted wine, and the closeness of family. The routines of Rome, whether in marble halls or smoky tenements, carried the heartbeat of a civilization. What strikes us today is both the familiarity and strangeness of these rhythms. We recognize the importance of meals, clothing, and daily rituals, yet in Rome they carried different meanings. Food was not only survival, but spectacle. Clothing was not just necessity, but status. The day's rhythm was not private, but interwoven with civic duty and religious ritual. In the mosaic of Roman life, each fragment, a loaf of bread, a woolen tunic, a shared bath, reflected the grandeur and the intimacy of a civilization that balanced the ordinary with the extraordinary. The measure of Roman life was not only in labor, family, or food, but also in leisure. A civilization that built roads across continents and aqueducts across valleys also built amphitheaters, circuses, and theaters designed not merely to serve but to astonish. Romans worked hard, endured the struggles of a sprawling empire, and then sought release in entertainment. For them, leisure was not an idle luxury, but a vital expression of community, identity, and power. At its simplest, Roman leisure began in the home or the street. Children played with toys that feel remarkably familiar: dolls carved from ivory or bone, little carts on wheels, balls of leather or inflated pig bladders. Boys tossed knucklebones, the ancient equivalent of dice, and girls amused themselves with miniature figurines. Adults played games too, from dice gambling to tabula, a board game akin to modern backgammon. Archaeological remains show gaming boards carved into the steps of temples and public squares, suggesting that leisure was not confined to the private sphere. Gambling was officially frowned upon, but it flourished nonetheless, especially during Saturnalia, when social norms briefly relaxed and even the most respectable citizens might wager openly. Beyond games, conversation itself was a form of entertainment. Taverns, baths, and marketplaces hummed with gossip, political debate, and rumor. The Romans relished satire, wit, and sharp humor. To listen, argue, and spar verbally was considered a skill as much as a pastime. Even poetry was not confined to the elite. Wandering poets recited verses in the forum, drawing crowds who listened, laughed, or jeered. But Roman leisure reached its most striking form in public entertainment. No civilization before them, and few after, poured such immense resources into amusement on such a scale. The crown jewel was, of course, the amphitheater, most famously the Colosseum in Rome, capable of holding more than 50,000 spectators. On days of games, the city stirred before dawn as crowds poured into its stone arches, clutching tickets marked with their assigned section. Seating was strictly organized by social rank: senators and equestrians nearest the action, common citizens higher up, women and the poor in the farthest tiers. Even here, status ruled. The spectacle itself was a carefully choreographed display of Roman might and order. Gladiatorial combat is what most imagine, and indeed it was central. Men trained in schools to fight before roaring crowds with swords, tridents, or nets. Some gladiators were enslaved, others criminals, and some volunteers seeking glory. They were adored like modern athletes, their names etched on walls, their likenesses painted on pottery, and their victories celebrated in songs. Yet the games were not limited to man against man. Wild beast hunts, venations, unleashed lions, leopards, and bears imported from across the empire. Exotic animals never before seen by Roman eyes were displayed, hunted, or pitted against each other. Sometimes entire battle reenactments filled the arena, with naval combats staged in flooded amphitheaters, ships clashing while spectators gasped at the scale of the performance. The thrill was in the uncertainty of life and death. A wounded gladiator, raising his hand in supplication, awaited the signal of mercy or doom from the presiding magistrate. The crowd's shouts often swayed the decision, turning the spectacle into a raw negotiation between violence, mercy, and popular will. Critics, even in antiquity, decried the bloodlust. But for many Romans, the arena was not cruelty. It was proof of discipline, courage, and the power of Rome itself. If the amphitheater offered violence, the circus offered speed. The Circus Maximus, capable of holding over 150,000 people, was the beating heart of Roman chariot racing. The thunder of hooves, the creak of wheels, and the roar of the crowd echoed across the city. Charioteers raced for teams, known by colors: the blues, greens, reds, and whites, and the loyalty of fans bordered on obsession. Entire neighborhoods pledged allegiance to a faction, riots sometimes erupting between rival supporters. Victories were celebrated in graffiti, mosaics, and song, and charioteers who triumphed often became immensely wealthy, adored by crowds as much as, if not more than, emperors. The theater, too, offered Romans escape and amusement. Plays were performed in open-air theaters built of stone, their tiers accommodating thousands. Comedy was especially popular, with playwrights like Plautus and Terence filling the stage with slapstick, clever servants, foolish masters, and tangled plots. Masks exaggerated expressions for audiences seated far away, and the humor often drew on everyday life, making it accessible to all. Tragedy was less common but respected, echoing Greek models with lofty themes of fate and gods. The theater was more than entertainment. It was a place where ideas circulated, where satire could mock the powerful, and where the Roman love of spectacle fused with intellectual play. Festivals punctuated the Roman year, blending religion, leisure, and indulgence. The calendar was studded with holidays, some solemn, others wild. Saturnalia, held in December, transformed the city into a carnival. Social rules inverted. Slaves dined at the same table as masters. Gifts were exchanged, and public merriment overflowed. For days, Rome laughed, gambled, feasted, and reveled. Other festivals honored gods with games, processions, and sacrifices, often culminating in public entertainments staged at state expense. These holidays gave rhythm to the year, moments when the empire paused to celebrate and reaffirm its bonds. Yet not all Roman leisure was so grand. Many sought relaxation in the countryside. Wealthy Romans retreated to villas, enjoying gardens, poetry readings, or quiet banquets. The philosopher Seneca wrote of the joys of calm solitude away from the noise of Rome. For the poor, leisure might mean strolling the crowded streets, watching street performers, or lingering at the baths after labor. To pause, to talk, to laugh with neighbors, these two were forms of entertainment that required no marble theaters or gilded arenas. What tied all of this together was the Roman understanding that leisure was not idleness, but a vital part of life. Even philosophers debated its purpose. Cicero and Seneca wrestled with the balance between otium leisure for reflection, philosophy, and personal growth, and negotium, public duty, labor, and business. To indulge too much in spectacle was frivolous, some argued, but to deny leisure altogether was to live without fullness. Rome, as always, sought a balance between the pragmatic and the grand dot in the roar of the Colosseum, in the thunder of the Circus Maximus, in the laughter at a tavern dice game. We glimpse the Romans not as marble statues or stern senators, but as people who, like us, longed for joy, thrill, and escape. Their leisure bound them together as much as their politics or wars. The arenas, theaters, and festivals were stages upon which Rome performed its identity. Fierce, disciplined, extravagant, and communal. For every hour of labor and duty, there was an hour of laughter, spectacle, or applause. In these moments, the empire was not simply governed, it was lived. If there was one thread woven into every part of Roman life, it was religion. For the Romans, the gods were not distant figures perched on some unreachable Olympus, but active presences embedded in fields, kitchens, crossroads, rivers, hearths, and the very walls of their homes. To live in Rome was to live surrounded by divine forces, each with demands, rituals, and signs that required constant attention. Daily life was not secular and then sacred. The two were inseparably fused. Every meal, every birth, every marriage, every contract, every victory and defeat carried with it an offering, a prayer, or an acknowledgement that unseen powers were listening. The Roman pantheon was immense, a blend of Italic gods, Greek imports, Etruscan deities, and countless local spirits. Jupiter, the king of the gods, ruled the skies, while Juno protected women and marriage. Mars, originally a god of agriculture, became the god of war and one of Rome's most honored patrons. Venus embodied love and beauty, Neptune commanded the seas, and Minerva, wisdom and crafts. Yet beyond these great Olympians were hundreds of lesser deities who played roles in the most ordinary activities. There was a god for door hinges, Cardia, a god for sowing seed satyr, even one for mildew that threatened crops. Romans saw no division between the monumental and the minute. Life was sacred because life was surrounded at every turn by the divine. Religion began at home. The lares and pinates, guardian spirits of the household and pantry, were honored daily. In many Roman homes, small shrines called lararia stood in the atrium or kitchen, adorned with figurines, wreaths, and offerings of food or wine. Before eating, a portion might be set aside for these spirits, an acknowledgement that the household flourished only with their blessing. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence reveal that even modest homes maintained these rituals. The hearth itself, sacred to Vesta, goddess of the flame, was not only a physical source of warmth but also a spiritual heart, tended carefully so that its fire never died out. Marriage, birth, and death were marked by elaborate rites designed to secure divine favor. A bride, on her wedding day, wore a flame-colored veil, invoking the hearth and the continuity of family. At birth, protective amulets and prayers shielded the infant from spirits of ill intent. Death required its own rituals, for Romans feared restless souls. Coins were placed in the mouth of the deceased to pay Chron, the ferryman of the underworld, and offerings ensured the departed would find peace. Festivals like the Parentalia and Lemuria were dedicated to honoring ancestors, with families leaving food at tombs or performing midnight rites to ward off vengeful spirits. To forget the dead was to risk their anger. To remember them was to keep the household secure. Beyond the home, religion shaped the city itself. Temples rose on hills, in forums, and at crossroads, dominating the skyline. The great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill was the heart of Roman religion. Its grandeur a statement of Rome's power and piety. Each temple housed the image of a god, tended by priests, and received sacrifices both private and public. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were led to altars, their entrails examined by haruspices for omens. Libations of wine poured onto the ground, incense burned, prayers spoken with precise formulas. All these actions reinforced the belief that Rome's fortune rested upon divine favor. Even the architecture itself reflected the grandeur of Rome's pact with the gods. Gleaming marble, towering columns, and sweeping steps invited both awe and devotion. The state and religion were inseparable. Priests were not cloistered holy men, but often politicians and magistrates, drawn from elite families. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, was as much a statesman as a religious leader. Auspices, the reading of omens from birds, preceded political assemblies and military campaigns. No law was passed, no war declared, no marriage or contract sealed without invoking the gods. Victories in battle were celebrated with processions to temples, spoils of war dedicated to deities. Failure to honor the gods correctly was believed to invite disaster, not just on the individual, but on the entire community. Festivals were the most visible expressions of religion in public life, filling the Roman calendar with a dizzying array of rites, games, and celebrations. Nearly half the days of the year were designated as festival or holy days, reminding citizens constantly of their obligations to the gods. Some, like the Lupercalia, were ancient fertility rituals involving priests running through the streets with strips of goat hide, striking onlookers to bestow luck and fruitfulness. Others, like the Floralia, celebrated the goddess Flora with theatrical performances and revelry. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses dedicated to Vesta, embodied purity and the security of the state. Their duty was to keep Rome's sacred flame alive, for its extinguishing would signal catastrophe. The very rhythm of Roman life was set to the pulse of these religious observances. Omens and divination infused even the most ordinary moments. To stumble on a threshold, to hear thunder on a wedding day, to glimpse a certain bird at dawn, all could be interpreted as signs. The Romans consulted augurs before journeys or ventures, their staff raised toward the sky as they watched the flight of birds. Haruspices studied the livers of sacrificed animals, searching for divine messages in their markings. dreams, too, were thought to carry the whispers of gods, requiring careful interpretation. To ignore or misread these signs was dangerous. To heed them brought a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Religion was also a political tool. Emperors, beginning with Augustus, wrapped themselves in divine imagery, claiming favor from gods or even divine ancestry. Temples were built to honor emperors as living gods, blending loyalty to ruler with loyalty to deity. The imperial cult spread across the empire, uniting far-flung provinces under shared rituals. To sacrifice for the emperor's genius, his divine spirit, was both an act of worship and a declaration of allegiance. Refusal could be seen as rebellion, which explains in part the persecution of early Christians, who denied such sacrifices and thus seemed to reject the Roman order itself. Yet for all its grandeur and politics, Roman religion remained deeply practical. It was less about theology or belief than about practice and ritual. The gods were not abstract concepts, but partners in a contract. If honored properly, they granted favor. If neglected, they punished. Romans rarely sought to understand divine mysteries. They sought to maintain harmony between human and divine worlds. Even foreign gods could be welcomed if they seemed powerful or useful. When crises struck, Rome imported cults, like that of the Great Mother from Asia Minor, believing new deities might strengthen the state. Religion was fluid, adaptive, and pragmatic, mirroring Rome's broader ability to absorb and integrate in the countryside. Local gods and spirits remained vital. Farmers offered prayers to Ceres for grain, to Terminus for boundary stones, to Sylvanus for woods and fields. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest, blending work and worship. Shrines dotted roadsides and fields, reminding travelers and workers alike that the divine was never far away. Even slaves carried their own small rituals, praying to ancestral gods or adopting Roman practices as they became part of households. Religion also shaped leisure and art. Many plays, poems, and artworks drew on mythological themes, retelling the stories of gods and heroes. Banquets might feature recitations of Homer or Virgil, linking Roman identity to divine narratives. Processions filled streets with music, color, and incense during festivals, creating spectacles as theatrical as any staged in amphitheaters. Religion was lived as experience, visible, audible, tangible, as much as it was revered in temples. For the ordinary Roman faith was not a matter of personal salvation or abstract philosophy. It was woven into the bread they ate, the wine they poured, the oaths they swore, and the very streets they walked. To be Roman was to participate in rituals, to acknowledge gods seen and unseen, and to live in a world where the sacred and mundane overlapped constantly. Their lives were bracketed by rituals, the cry of a newborn greeted by prayers, the wedding chant invoking Juno, the funeral procession bearing libations to the tomb. Religion was not apart from life, it was life, as we imagine Rome, its bustling forums, its sprawling villas, its crowded apartments. We must imagine to the smoke of incense curling above an altar, the murmur of prayers whispered in kitchens, the distant sound of temple bells, the sudden hush as an augur raised his staff to read the sky. The Roman world was a tapestry threaded with gods, and every citizen, from senator to slave, was a weaver in that fabric, shaping daily life in rhythm with the divine. If religion permeated every corner of Roman daily life, education and the pursuit of knowledge gave structure to the way Romans thought, reasoned, and governed their empire. Rome was not only a city of soldiers and builders, it was also a city of writers, philosophers, and teachers, in the shadow of its massive aqueducts and forums. In between the clamor of markets and spectacles, Romans spent countless hours reading, writing, debating, and instructing their children. Knowledge was power, but it was also identity. To be Roman meant not just to rule with armies, but to master the words, traditions, and intellectual heritage that defined their civilization. Education began in the home. Parents were the first teachers, and mothers, especially, played a central role in shaping young children's early years. Roman mothers taught their sons and daughters their first words, stories of ancestors, and lessons in respect and discipline. Tales of heroes like Aeneas or Horatius at the bridge were not only bedtime stories, but moral blueprints, teaching courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Fathers instilled a sense of duty, stressing mos maiarum, the customs of the ancestors, which emphasized honor, piety, and devotion to the family and state. A child's earliest environment was one of constant observation and imitation, with the household serving as both classroom and moral compass. Formal education, however, was highly stratified. Wealthy families could afford private tutors, often Greek slaves or freedmen, who taught their children reading, writing, arithmetic, and Greek language. Greek was the lingua franca of philosophy and literature, and mastery of it was considered essential for any aspiring Roman statesman. For the sons of aristocrats, fluency in both Latin and Greek was the gateway to power. Poorer children, by contrast, might learn only basic literacy, enough to conduct trade or serve in an administrative role, if they learned at all. Many of Rome's lower classes remained illiterate, relying on public criers or inscriptions to understand civic decrees. The Roman educational system was divided into stages. The first was the ludus literarius, where young children learned basic literacy and numeracy under the guidance of a literator. Using wax tablets and styluses, students painstakingly traced letters, recited the alphabet, and practiced copying simple sentences. Punishment was common. Discipline was seen as essential for producing orderly citizens. The second stage was instruction by the grammaticus, typically beginning around age 12, where students read and analyzed poetry, history, and speeches, particularly those of Greek and Roman masters like Homer, Virgil, and Cicero. This stage emphasized grammar, style, and the art of composition. The final stage, for those destined for political or legal careers, was instruction by the rhetor, a teacher of oratory. Here students practiced the art of persuasion, composing speeches, debating mock cases, and learning to sway crowds with logic, emotion, and performance. For Rome, rhetoric was not just a skill, but a weapon, the tool by which senators, generals, and emperors shaped policy and commanded loyalty. Education, however, was not universal, nor was it free from gendered expectations. While elite girls sometimes received the same education as boys, particularly in wealthy households that valued intellectual accomplishment, most Roman girls were trained primarily in domestic management. They learned how to oversee servants, manage household finances, weave, and prepare for marriage. Nevertheless, evidence suggests that many women were literate, and some became poets, philosophers, or patrons of intellectual circles. Figures like Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, were celebrated for their learning and moral authority. Her eloquence and wisdom were said to have shaped her sons' political careers, proving that women, though excluded from public office, could wield influence through education and family. Philosophy occupied a central place in Roman intellectual life, from the late Republic through the Empire. Greek philosophical schools, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and later Neoplatonism found fertile ground in Rome. Stoicism, with its emphasis on duty, self-control, and alignment with nature, resonated deeply with Roman ideals of discipline and service. Statesmen like Seneca, generals like Marcus Aurelius, and countless others found in Stoicism a moral compass for navigating the uncertainties of power and life. You have power over your mind, not outside events, Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, a reflection that echoed Rome's belief in inner strength even amid external chaos. Epicureanism, on the other hand, was often misunderstood. While it promoted a life of modest pleasure and freedom from fear, Romans caricatured it as indulgence, though in practice it appealed to those seeking tranquility in a world of constant upheaval. Philosophy was not only a private pursuit, but also a public spectacle. Philosophers lectured in porticos, forums, and gardens, drawing audiences who debated the nature of the cosmos, the soul, and the good life. For many Romans, these discussions were not just abstract exercises, but practical guides to daily conduct. How should one approach death? How should one endure poverty or grief? How should one live virtuously within the demands of empire? These questions were not theoretical luxuries, but urgent concerns in a society marked by constant change, wealth disparity, and political violence. In this way, philosophy was woven into the very fabric of Roman existence. Literacy and literature further defined Roman identity. Rome produced some of the greatest writers of antiquity. Virgil, whose Aeneid provided Rome with its mythic origin story. Ovid, whose Metamorphoses spun myths into dazzling poetry. Horace, master of lyric verse. Cicero, whose speeches and letters defined the art of oratory. Tacitus, who chronicled the moral decay of the empire. And Pliny, whose encyclopedic writings attempted to capture the natural world. To be educated in Rome was to be steeped in this literary tradition, to quote it, analyze it, and use it as both inspiration and ammunition. Young men trained in rhetoric practiced by imitating these masters, reciting passages and crafting responses to their themes. Public readings of poetry and history were popular events, drawing crowds eager to hear new works or honor established authors. Libraries became central hubs of Roman intellectual life. Wealthy individuals maintained private collections, and emperors like Augustus and Trajan founded public libraries in Rome itself. Scrolls of papyrus and later codices filled shelves, containing everything from philosophy and science to poetry and law. For the Roman elite, to collect and display books was not only a matter of personal interest, but also a sign of status. Knowledge was both cultivated and exhibited, a marker of refinement and prestige. Scholars and scribes worked tirelessly to copy texts, preserving works of Greece and producing new Roman contributions. Without this relentless commitment to literacy and preservation, much of classical civilization might have been lost. Beyond formal education and philosophy, Romans engaged in a wide range of intellectual pursuits. Astronomy guided their calendars, medicine informed their health, and law shaped their civic life. Roman law, in particular, became one of their greatest legacies, codifying principles of justice, property, and citizenship that would echo through Western civilization for centuries. Engineers and architects applied mathematics and physics to construct aqueducts, roads, bridges, and monumental structures that stood as both practical achievements and testaments to intellectual rigor. Knowledge was not only preserved in books and speeches, but embodied in stone, brick, and mortar across the empire. It is important to recognize, however, that intellectual life was not uniform across Roman society. While senators, philosophers, and wealthy landowners immersed themselves in rhetoric and literature, the majority of Romans engaged with knowledge more practically. Market traders learned arithmetic to handle transactions. Craftsmen passed on skills through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. Farmers relied on almanacs, superstition, and practical observation more than on written texts. Still, the influence of literacy trickled down. Graffiti scrawled on walls in Pompeii reveals not only political slogans, but also jokes, insults, poetry, and even advertisements. Education may have been unequal, but the hunger for expression and communication was universal. Roman education also reflected the empire's cultural diversity. In provinces, local traditions blended with Roman schooling. Children in Gaul or Egypt might learn Latin for administration while retaining their native languages at home. Greek influence remained especially strong, particularly in the eastern provinces, where schools and intellectual circles rivaled or even surpassed those of Rome. This cultural exchange enriched Roman learning, ensuring that its intellectual life was not insular but cosmopolitan, a blend of traditions from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Perhaps most tellingly, education was never an end in itself, but always a means to an end. The shaping of citizens. A Roman boy was not educated merely to write poetry or read philosophy. He was educated to serve the state, to argue cases, to govern provinces, to lead armies. Knowledge was inextricably tied to duty. The ideal Roman combined the wisdom of the philosopher with the courage of the soldier and the eloquence of the orator. Education was the forge that attempted to produce such men, even if reality often fell short of the ideal. When we peel away the marble facades, the glittering banquets, and the rhetoric of senators, the true pulse of Rome is found in its work. Labor, in all its forms, sustained the empire. From the hands that harvested grain on distant estates to the craftsmen hammering bronze in cramped workshops. From the slaves sweating in mines to the merchants shouting prices in crowded forums. Rome's economy was powered by human effort. To understand daily life in Rome, one must walk among the workers, listen to their tools, and watch the endless rhythm of toil that kept the empire alive. Agriculture formed the backbone of Roman society. No matter how urbanized Rome appeared, with its teeming streets and monumental buildings, it remained at heart an agrarian civilization. Grain was king. Fields across Italy and the provinces of Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily produced the wheat that filled Rome's granaries and kept its people fed. Wealthy landowners, the latifundia elite, controlled vast estates worked by slaves or tenant farmers. These estates not only fed their masters, but also supplied the state with the grain that ensured social stability. Bread, after all, was more than food. It was political currency. The unknowner Rome's grain dole distributed free or subsidized bread to the poor of the city, pacifying the masses and securing loyalty to the state. Behind every loaf of bread handed out in the forum was the labor of countless farmers, millers, and bakers, whose sweat sustained the Roman promise of plenty. Yet agriculture was not confined to the estates of the wealthy. Small farmers still clung to their plots, eking out a living on modest parcels of land. These men and women rose with the sun, plowing with oxen, sowing seeds by hand and reaping harvests with sickles. Their lives were precarious, subject to drought, flood, or invasion. But their persistence embodied the Roman ideal of rustic virtue. The farmer was celebrated in poetry and politics alike, idealized as the moral backbone of the state. Even as economic realities pushed many into poverty or forced them to abandon their land for the swelling cities dot beyond the fields, the hum of industry filled Rome. Artisans and craftsmen formed the middle tier of the economy, producing the goods that sustained daily life. Potters spun clay into amphorae for wine and oil. Blacksmiths forged weapons, tools, and household implements. Carpenters shaped timber into furniture, wagons, and building supports. Weavers and dyers produced the tunics and togas that clothed Rome's citizens, while glassmakers crafted delicate vessels prized across the empire. These trades were often organized into collegia, guild-like associations that regulated apprenticeships, maintained standards, and provided mutual support. Membership offered identity and security in an unpredictable world, binding individuals into communities defined not by wealth or politics, but by craft. Commerce was the lifeblood of Rome's urban centers. The Forum, in addition to its political and religious roles, was a marketplace where merchants displayed wares, shouted prices, and haggled with customers. Stalls overflowed with goods, figs and olives from Italy, silks from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, amber from the Baltic, and furs from the far north. The Roman economy was astonishingly global for its time, linking distant corners of the world in networks of trade. Ships crossed the Mediterranean laden with cargo, their sails dotting the horizon, while caravans trudged across deserts and mountains, carrying luxury goods that dazzled the Roman elite. Not all trade was glamorous, of course. Daily commerce included bakers selling bread, butchers offering cuts of meat, fishmongers hawking their catch, and vintners pouring cheap wine into clay cups. Street vendors added to the cacophony, balancing trays of food or trinkets and weaving through crowds to find customers. For many Romans, meals were purchased from such vendors or eaten in thermopolia, small eateries where hot stews and bread were served to those without kitchens. In these bustling hubs, work and sustenance intertwined, as laborers exchanged coins earned in sweat for the fuel that kept them going. Slavery underpinned much of this economy. Rome was a slave society, and enslaved laborers performed countless tasks, from agricultural toil to domestic service, from skilled craftsmanship to dangerous mining. In households, slaves cooked, cleaned, and educated children. On estates, they plowed fields, harvested crops, and tended animals. In workshops, they produced goods under the eye of their masters. Some slaves, highly skilled or educated, worked as scribes, accountants, or physicians. Others endured the brutal life of mines and quarries, where conditions were so harsh that survival was short. Though many slaves dreamed of freedom, manumission, the granting of liberty was not uncommon, and freedmen often became prosperous tradesmen or administrators, blending the boundary between servitude and citizenship. The economic hierarchy of Rome was steep. At the top stood the senatorial elite, whose wealth came from vast estates, rents, and political power. Below them were the equestrians, a class of wealthy businessmen and landowners who often engaged in commerce, contracts, and tax collection. Middle-class artisans, shopkeepers, and freedmen formed the backbone of urban life, while the poor struggled on the margins, reliant on casual labor, charity, or the grain dole. This stratification shaped daily life. The wealthy enjoyed luxury, leisure, and influence, while the poor endured uncertainty and hardship. Their survival depended on steady work or the whims of patrons. Work was not only economic, but also social. Patronage bound the classes together in webs of obligation. Wealthy patrons provided employment, legal assistance, or financial support to their poorer clients, who in turn offered loyalty, votes, or public displays of respect. This system blurred the lines between work and politics, embedding labor into the broader structure of Roman society. Even the act of appearing at a patron's home in the morning, this was a kind of labor, one that secured the protection and favor necessary for survival. Specialized trades gave texture to Roman cities. Bakers worked before dawn, grinding grain and firing ovens to produce the bread that fed the masses. Fullers' launderers soaked clothes in vats of water mixed with urine, stomping garments clean and whitening them with chalk. Tanners processed animal hides in workshops that reeked of flesh and chemicals, producing leather for armor, sandals, and everyday goods. Builders and stonemasons labored on endless construction projects, erecting temples, aqueducts, and baths that transformed the landscape. Each trade added its sounds, smells, and rhythms to the city, creating a living symphony of work. Even leisure was shaped by labor. Gladiatorial games, so central to Roman culture, relied on the work of trainers, armorers, and medical attendants. Theaters required actors, musicians, and stagehands. Chariot races demanded grooms, carpenters, and craftsmen to maintain the teams and vehicles. Behind every spectacle that entertained the Roman public lay armies of workers whose toil remained largely unseen. Their contributions absorbed into the glory of the event. In the provinces, work took on different forms but retained the same centrality. Soldiers stationed along frontiers doubled as builders and farmers, constructing fortifications, bridges, and roads. Provincial farmers adapted Roman agricultural techniques to local conditions, producing surplus for export. Artisans blended Roman styles with local traditions, creating unique cultural hybrids. Trade networks extended outward, linking provincial labor to the wealth of Rome itself. Whether in Gaul, Britain, Egypt, or Judea, work tied distant lands into the economic web of the empire. Despite the importance of work, Roman culture harbored ambivalence toward labor. Elite writers often disparaged manual labor as demeaning, fit only for slaves or the lower classes. Cicero, for example, considered trade dishonorable if it lacked refinement, and manual crafts unworthy of a free citizen. Yet these same elites depended on the labor of others for their wealth and leisure. Farmers, artisans, and merchants were idealized in rhetoric, but marginalized in reality. Their toil invisible beneath the grandeur it enabled. This tension reveals much about Roman society. The glory of empire was built on the backs of those whose work was least celebrated. At the same time, Romans recognized that labor was essential. Festivals honored Ceres, goddess of agriculture, and Vulcan, god of fire and craftsmanship. Inscriptions praised workers for their contributions, and tombs sometimes depicted tools of trade, hammers, plows, looms, as symbols of identity. Work may not have carried the prestige of politics or war, but it gave meaning and shape to countless lives. For many Romans, their craft was their legacy, the skill by which they supported their families and left their mark on the world. To walk through a Roman city, then, was to witness an economy in motion. The clang of hammers from a smithy mixed with the shouts of vendors, the bleating of livestock, and the rattle of carts on cobblestones. The air was thick with the smell of bread baking, fish frying, leather tanning, and wool dyeing. Every alley and forum corner was alive with activity, each worker contributing in ways that were humble yet essential. Rome's greatness was not only in its emperors or legions, but also in the unending rhythm of its laborers, the countless hands that day after day built, maintained, and sustained a civilization. If labor was the heartbeat of Rome, then leisure was its soul. Work sustained life, but leisure gave it texture, rhythm, and meaning. To live in Rome was not only to toil and survive, but also to seek pleasure, amusement, and release. The Romans, more than perhaps any other people of antiquity, embraced entertainment as both a necessity and an art form. They transformed leisure into spectacle, elevating games, festivals, and social gatherings into the very fabric of their society. In doing so, they revealed not only their tastes and values, but also the contradictions and complexities of their civilization. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of Roman leisure was the amphitheater, with the Colosseum in Rome as its crown jewel. This colossal structure, capable of seating tens of thousands, was more than an arena. It was a theater of empire. Here, emperors staged lavish games, munera that blended politics with performance. Gladiators fought for honor, survival, and spectacle, their every movement cheered or jeered by the roaring crowd. These combats, brutal as they were, reflected Rome's fascination with courage, endurance, and the boundary between life and death. The games were not merely entertainment. They were rituals of power, affirming the strength of the state and the generosity of rulers who provided them free of charge. Gladiators themselves embodied a paradox. Many were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war forced into combat. Yet their prowess could win them fame, admiration, and even freedom. The names of popular gladiators echoed through Rome, their likenesses painted on walls or etched into lamps. Some drew the devotion of fans not unlike modern athletes, celebrated in songs and graffiti. The arena, in its blood and spectacle, became a place where fate was both merciless and strangely democratic, offering the possibility of glory to the lowliest of men. But the games did not stop with gladiators. The amphitheaters hosted wild beast hunts, the nations were exotic animals from across. The empire were pitted against each other, or against human hunters. Lions from Africa, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile, and bears from the northern forests were brought into Rome, their presence a reminder of the empire's vast reach. These spectacles thrilled audiences with their strangeness and danger, though they often came at the cost of immense cruelty. Animals were slaughtered in staggering numbers, their deaths staged as symbols of Rome's dominion over nature and foreign lands. Alike, even grander still, were the Naumachia staged naval battles. In specially constructed basins or even flooded amphitheaters, ships clashed in miniature recreations of famous sea battles. Thousands of participants, often condemned men, fought amid elaborate sets, their struggle transforming the arena into an ocean of chaos. Such displays demonstrated the technical prowess of Rome, but also the lengths to which emperors would go to awe their people. For the audience, it was spectacle on a scale few could imagine. A vision of empire encapsulated in theater and blood. Yet leisure in Rome was not confined to the grand arenas. Chariot racing, perhaps even more popular than gladiatorial games, filled the Circus Maximus with unparalleled fervor. This massive stadium, capable of holding upwards of 150,000 spectators, was a place of passion, rivalry, and communal ecstasy. Teams, the blues, greens, reds, and whites inspired loyalty that bordered on fanaticism. Fans wore colors, sang chants, and bet fortunes on their favorite charioteers. The races themselves were dangerous and thrilling. As chariots sped around the track, horses straining and drivers risking death at every turn. Crashes were frequent, and the cries of triumph mingled with the groans of disaster. To be in the Circus Maximus was to feel the pulse of Rome itself. A massive humanity united in anticipation, joy, and heartbreak. The theatre offered another form of entertainment, appealing less to bloodlust and more to wit and performance. Romans inherited theatrical traditions from the Greeks, staging tragedies, comedies, and pantomime. Actors wore masks, gestured broadly, and performed before lively crowds. Comedy, in particular, delighted audiences with its satirical takes on everyday life, poking fun at politicians, lovers, and fools. Pantomime, a blend of dance and acting accompanied by music, became immensely popular, captivating audiences with its elegance and storytelling. Though critics sometimes disparaged theatre as frivolous or corrupting, it provided an essential outlet for laughter, reflection, and communal experience. Not all leisure was so grand. Daily life offered smaller, more intimate pleasures that wove entertainment into the ordinary. Taverns and popinae, modest eateries and drinking houses, were hubs of social life, where workers gathered to share food, drink cheap wine, and exchange gossip. Dice games and gambling added to the merriment, though they also brought risk and ruin. Inns and bathhouses echoed with conversation, laughter, and sometimes illicit pleasures, blending the practical with the indulgent. For many, leisure meant little more than a shared jug of wine and a song in the company of friends. The Roman baths, however, elevated leisure to ritual. Public baths, or thermae, were not merely places to wash, but centers of social, cultural, and even political life. Citizens of all classes mingled in their sprawling complexes, moving from hot rooms to cold plunges, from exercise yards to libraries. Bathing was as much about relaxation as about display, a chance to see and be seen, to converse, strike deals, and cultivate networks. For a modest fee, one could enjoy the luxuries of heat, water, and leisure that otherwise belonged only to the wealthy. In this way, baths democratized indulgence, offering ordinary Romans a taste of refinement and community. Leisure also flourished in the form of festivals. Rome's calendar was crowded with holidays, religious, political, and cultural, that punctuated the year with celebration. Saturnalia, perhaps the most famous, turned the social order upside down for a brief time. Masters served slaves, gifts were exchanged, and merriment filled the streets. The festival embodied both the joy and the contradictions of Roman life, granting temporary liberty in a society built on hierarchy. Other festivals honored gods, celebrated victories, or marked seasonal changes, each accompanied by feasting, games, and public ceremonies. For Romans, leisure was inseparable from ritual, binding community and belief in moments of collective joy. Intellectual leisure, too, had its place. Wealthier Romans cultivated gardens, libraries, and salons where they could read, write, and debate. Philosophy, poetry, and history were discussed over wine, often with passion equal to that of the circus. Stoicism, Epicureanism, and other schools of thought provided frameworks for living, offering guidance on virtue, pleasure, and fate. For some, leisure was found not in spectacle or indulgence, but in reflection, study, and the cultivation of wisdom. To recline in a shaded garden, scroll in hand, was as much a Roman pleasure as cheering a chariot race. Children found their own forms of leisure, playing with dolls, balls, hoops, and board games. Simple amusements filled their days, echoing the rhythms of adult life while granting space for joy and creativity. Soldiers on campaign also sought diversion, playing dice, competing in athletic contests, or telling stories around the fire. Even slaves carved out moments of leisure, finding respite in music, dance, or festivals, where for a time the burdens of labor could be set aside. The diversity of Roman leisure reveals a society both unified and divided. While elites enjoyed private banquets, refined entertainments, and intellectual pursuits, the masses flocked to public spectacles, taverns, and baths. Leisure both bridged and reinforced social divides, offering common ground in festivals and baths, while highlighting inequality in exclusive villas and theaters. In all its forms, however, leisure was essential. It provided relief from labor, affirmed identity, and gave life, color, and vibrancy. Yet leisure also carried a darker side. Critics warned of excess, corruption, and distraction. Moralists lamented the decadence of games, the frivolity of festivals, and the dangers of indulgence. They feared that Rome's obsession with entertainment sapped its strength, eroding the virtues of discipline and duty that had built the empire. The phrase bread and circuses, coined by the poet Juvenal, captured this anxiety. The idea that Rome's people were pacified with food and spectacle, distracted from politics and decline. Leisure, in this view, was not a celebration of life, but a symptom of decay. And yet, leisure was inescapably Roman. It defined the rhythms of the city, filled its spaces with noise and color, and provided shared experiences that bound its people together. Whether in the grandeur of the Colosseum or the intimacy of a tavern, in the solemnity of a festival or the laughter of a comedy, Romans lived their leisure as fully as their labor. It was through leisure that they celebrated their empire, their gods, and themselves, affirming both their unity and their diversity. If the public spaces of Rome, its forums, baths, amphitheaters, and circuses defined the grandeur of the empire, then the home revealed its heart. The Roman household was not merely a place of shelter, but the fundamental building block of society. It was within its walls that values were taught, traditions upheld, and identities shaped. Family life was sacred, both in its practical and spiritual dimensions. And to understand Rome fully, one must step through the doorway of its homes and glimpse the rhythms of daily domesticity at the center. Of the Roman household stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. He wielded immense authority, both legally and culturally, his power extending over his wife, children, slaves, and property. Roman law granted him patria potestas, the power of the father, a concept so deep that it allowed him, at least in theory, to arrange marriages, approve or disapprove of careers, and even determine matters of life and death for his children. While in practice, these powers softened over time and were tempered by custom. The figure of the paterfamilias symbolized the authority and responsibility of maintaining the family line and its honor. But the family was not a hierarchy of domination alone. It was also a partnership of duty. The Roman wife, or materfamilias, though lacking many legal rights, held enormous influence within the household. She managed domestic affairs, oversaw slaves, directed the preparation of food and clothing, and safeguarded the moral reputation of her family. In wealthier homes, she presided over vast households, orchestrating a complex web of servants, artisans, and dependents. In more modest homes, she worked alongside her husband and children, weaving cloths, cooking meals, and tending to the daily labors of survival. Roman literature often praised the ideal wife as diligent, modest, and devoted, though in reality, many women navigated their roles with intelligence and independence, sometimes exerting quiet power over family decisions. Children held a special place in Roman families, cherished as the continuation of the bloodline and the hope of future honor. From their earliest days, children were taught obedience, respect, and discipline. Education began in the home, with parents or tutors instilling basic literacy and moral lessons. Sons were prepared for the responsibilities of citizenship, while daughters were groomed for marriage and household management. Yet despite these expectations, Roman childhood was not devoid of joy. Toys such as dolls, balls, hoops, and miniature wagons filled their play, and festivals often granted them a share of merriment. Roman parents, despite the formality of discipline, expressed tenderness toward their children, grieving deeply when illness or misfortune, all too common, cut young lives short. The household itself, whether humble or grand, reflected the rhythms of domestic life. Wealthy families inhabited domas, large houses with atriums, courtyards, and intricate mosaics. The atrium served as the heart of the home, a space where family and guests gathered, lit by the open skylight above. Here stood the household shrine, or lavish, where daily offerings were made to the spirits of the household, ensuring their favor and protection. Beyond the atrium lay dining rooms, bedrooms, and private gardens, spaces designed not only for living, but for displaying wealth, taste, and cultural refinement. Frescoes adorned the walls, depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, and patterns, while intricate mosaics decorated the floors, offering glimpses of both beauty and status. For the poor, homes were more modest, often confined to cramped apartments known as insulae. These multi-storied buildings housed dozens of families, sometimes with little more than a single room per household. Space was limited, sanitation poor, and fire hazards common. Cooking often took place in communal areas or on small braziers, and privacy was scarce. Yet even here, family bonds provided warmth and resilience. Neighbors formed tight-knit communities, sharing burdens, joys, and the daily struggle to survive in the heart of the empire. The grandeur of marble villas may have dazzled, but the humbler insulae told the truer story of how most Romans lived. Religion permeated Roman family life, blurring the line between domestic and divine. Every home, regardless of size, contained sacred spaces devoted to the household gods, the lares and pinates. These deities guarded the family's well-being, their small statues placed in niches or shrines within the home. Each day, offerings of food, wine, or incense were made to them, binding the family to the divine through ritual. The hearth, too, was sacred, tended with care as the center of both warmth and worship. In honoring these deities, Romans believed they secured not only prosperity, but also continuity, ensuring that the spirits of ancestors remained watchful and benevolent. Ancestor worship was particularly central to Roman domestic religion. The memory of the dead was preserved through images, names, and rituals, with families cherishing their lineage and honoring those who came before. Masks of ancestors, Imagines were displayed during funerals or ceremonies, linking the living to the weight of history. The family, in this way, was never simply present. It was an unbroken chain stretching backward and forward, with each generation entrusted to uphold the honor and traditions of its line. Meals, though practical, carried symbolic weight within the household. The act of dining together reinforced bonds of kinship and hierarchy. Wealthier families dined in style, reclining on couches in the triclinium, surrounded by fine foods, servants, and conversation. The meal itself was as much performance as sustenance, an opportunity to display refinement, generosity, and culture. For poorer families, meals were simpler, often consisting of bread, porridge, olives, and whatever meat or vegetables could be afforded. Yet even in these humbler settings, the act of sharing food carried deep meaning, affirming the strength of family ties and the simple pleasure of sustenance. Marriage, too, stood at the core of Roman family life. While often arranged to secure alliances, property, or political advantage, marriage was nonetheless viewed as a partnership essential to the continuation of family and society. Wedding ceremonies blended solemnity with festivity, invoking the gods through ritual while celebrating the union with music, feasts, and laughter. The bride, adorned with a flame-colored veil and wreaths, was led to her new home in a procession lit by torches, symbolizing the transfer of responsibility from her father's household to her husband's. Once inside, she joined her new family in worship at the household shrine, binding herself not only to her husband but to his ancestors and deities. Slaves, ever present in Roman households, formed another layer of domestic life. Their labor sustained the family, whether in cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, or tending to estates. Though their existence was marked by subjugation, slaves were often integrated into the fabric of the household, their lives intertwined with those they served. Some grew close to their masters, entrusted with intimate responsibilities, while others endured hardship and neglect. Freedmen, former slaves who had gained liberty, often maintained ties to the families they once served, forming bonds that blurred the lines between servitude and kinship. The presence of slavery in Roman homes reveals both the intimacy and inequality that coexisted. At the heart of domestic life, family rituals extended beyond daily offerings. Births, marriages, and deaths were marked with ceremonies that tied the private to the public, the personal to the divine. At birth, infants were presented to the household gods, their survival and health prayed for with marriage rituals, as mentioned, blended, sacred, and social, while death brought elaborate funerals. Processions carried the dead through the streets, accompanied by mourners, music, and rites. Burial sites became spaces of memory and reverence, ensuring that the deceased remained part of the family's ongoing story. In all these moments, religion and family intertwined, affirming life's cycles within the framework of tradition and belief. But domestic life was not merely solemn. It was filled with warmth, laughter, and affection. Letters from antiquity reveal parents worrying over absent children, spouses writing with tenderness, and friends exchanging tokens of love. Poets such as Catullus wrote verses celebrating intimacy, passion, and companionship. Beyond the authority of the paterfamilias and the weight of tradition, families shared joy in simple pleasures, a child's first words, a shared joke at the table, the warmth of a winter fire. These small moments of humanity remind us that behind the grandeur of Rome lay ordinary lives, filled with the same emotions and bonds that connect us today. The Roman family, in all its complexity, was a microcosm of the empire itself. It reflected the hierarchies, values, and contradictions of society, embodying both authority and affection, discipline and joy. It was here, in the rhythms of domestic life, that Romans experienced their most enduring connections to one another, to their ancestors, and to their gods. While emperors and generals may have shaped the headlines of history, it was in the quiet rituals of family life that the essence of Rome truly resided. If the Roman home was guarded by the watchful spirits of the hearth, then the city itself was protected by a vast pantheon of gods whose favor was sought in every decision. To the Romans, religion was not a matter of personal belief in the modern sense, but of duty, ritual, and tradition. They spoke of pietas, the sacred obligation to honor the gods, the family, and the state. Religion was a contract. Humans performed the proper rituals, and in return, the gods granted protection, fertility, and victory. Failure in ritual or neglect of divine will was not merely a personal matter, but a threat to the entire community. Thus, religion saturated Roman public life as completely as water fills a vessel. Its presence inescapable, its influence profound. At the heart of Rome's public religion stood its temples, magnificent structures that dotted the cityscape. Each was dedicated to a particular deity: Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Venus, and countless others, their gleaming columns and statues rising as both architectural marvels and spiritual sanctuaries. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill symbolized the might of the Roman state itself, while smaller shrines could be found on nearly every street corner. Inside the innermost chamber, the cella, housed the cult statue of the deity, cared for by priests and approached with reverence by worshippers. The temple was less a place for congregational prayer than a sacred house for the god. Its rituals performed by designated officials rather than ordinary citizens. Yet for the people, the temple's presence was constant, its steps and courtyards bustling with offerings, prayers, and festivals. Priests and priestesses formed the official guardians of this religious world. Their roles were as much political as spiritual, for religion in Rome was deeply tied to governance. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, wielded immense influence, overseeing the religious calendar, maintaining ritual purity, and interpreting the will of the gods. In time, this title would be claimed by emperors themselves, blending spiritual and political authority into one. Other priestly colleges, such as the augurs, flamens, and vestals, each carried unique responsibilities. The augurs, for example, read the will of the gods through the flight of birds, interpreting omens before battles, elections, or state decisions. The flamens tended to the rites of specific deities, their lives bound by strict taboos and rituals. Each role was a thread in the larger tapestry, ensuring that the rituals of Rome were performed without error and that divine favor remained secure. The Vestal Virgins, perhaps the most renowned of Rome's priests, guarded the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as young girls, these priestesses lived lives of privilege and solemn duty, bound to 30 years of service. Their chastity symbolized the purity of the state itself, and their role was both honored and feared. A Vestal who neglected her duties or broke her vows faced severe punishment, for such transgressions were believed to endanger the very survival of Rome. Yet, they also enjoyed a status rare for women in Roman society, possessing independence, wealth, and influence. The Vestals remind us of the seriousness with which Romans approached their rituals. believing that the fate of the empire was tied to the care of sacred fires, sacrifices, and vows. Sacrifice lay at the heart of Roman religious practice. Animals, sheep, pigs, bulls were offered to the gods, their slaughter accompanied by prayers and ritual gestures. The entrails, particularly the liver, were examined by priests known as haruspices to read divine approval or disfavor. These sacrifices were not acts of blind cruelty but transactions, a gift to the gods in exchange for their protection and blessings. Mistakes in the ritual, even small ones, could invalidate the ceremony, requiring it to be repeated. For the Romans, precision mattered. To honor the gods was not simply to feel reverence, but to act correctly, to preserve the sacred contract with diligence and respect. Festivals marked the Roman calendar, with a rhythm of celebration and ritual that bound the community together. Nearly every month boasted sacred days devoted to particular gods, blending solemn rites with public revelry. The Lupercalia, celebrated in February, honored fertility and purification. Priests, clad in animal skins, ran through the streets, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide, a symbolic act believed to promote health and fertility. The Saturnalia, held in December, was a festival of reversal and merriment. When social hierarchies were upended, masters served slaves, and gifts were exchanged in a spirit of joy. It was during Saturnalia that Romans experienced a rare suspension of order, a taste of equality that delighted both rich and poor. The Ludi Romani, games in honor of Jupiter, filled the city with spectacles, races, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial contests, blending entertainment with religious devotion, omens and divination infused. Roman decision. No battle was undertaken, no law passed, no marriage celebrated without first consulting the will of the gods. Augurs studied the sky, noting the flight of birds, the direction of lightning, or unusual natural events. The haruspices, as mentioned, examined the entrails of sacrificial animals. Even the most powerful generals and politicians submitted to these rituals, aware that neglect could spell disaster not only for themselves but for the state. When the gods were displeased, it was believed calamities followed, floods, plagues, defeats in war. To maintain harmony with the divine was therefore not optional but essential to Rome's survival. Religion also served as a means of political control. The Senate oversaw many religious matters, ensuring that rituals aligned with the interests of the state. Public temples were often funded by generals to commemorate victories, their grandeur both a display of piety and a monument to personal glory. Emperors, in particular, harnessed religion to reinforce their authority. Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus, while Augustus promoted the worship of his guardian, Apollo. Over time, emperors themselves became objects of veneration, their cults spreading across the empire. Temples were raised in their honor, priests appointed to their worship, and loyalty to the emperor expressed through ritual sacrifice. In this way, religion and power became inseparable, each reinforcing the other in the service of empire. Yet Roman religion was not rigidly closed. The empire's expansion brought with it new gods, cults, and traditions, many of which were adopted or adapted into Roman life. The cult of Isis from Egypt, the worship of Mithras from Persia, and the mysteries of Cybele all found followers in Rome. These foreign cults often offered personal salvation, secret rituals, and emotional devotion, elements sometimes lacking in the traditional state religion. While the Senate occasionally attempted to suppress such practices, especially when they seemed politically threatening, many persisted, enriching the religious landscape of the empire. Rome's strength lay not in exclusion, but in absorption, weaving together a tapestry of beliefs that reflected the diversity of its people. Public religious processions and ceremonies offered spectacles that both awed and united the populace. On feast days, statues of gods were carried through the streets, accompanied by priests, musicians, and crowds of worshippers. Sacred games filled the theaters and arenas, their rituals invoking divine favor even as they entertained the masses. Religion was thus never confined to hushed temples. It spilled into the streets, woven into the rhythms of civic life. Even the marketplace bore its shrines, the milestones their inscriptions to the gods. To be a Roman was to live in constant dialogue with the divine, one's daily path marked by symbols, rituals, and sacred reminders. For the ordinary citizen, participation in this vast religious system meant more than simple ritual. It meant belonging. Festivals were communal events, bringing together rich and poor in shared celebration. Sacrifices and offerings, though often performed by officials, were believed to benefit the entire community. The gods were guardians not only of individuals, but of Rome itself, their favor ensuring harvests, victories, and prosperity. To neglect them was to endanger all. Thus, even the humblest Roman, making a small offering of wine or bread at a roadside shrine, was part of a larger web of devotion that stretched from the family hearth to the marble temples of the Capitoline Dot, in reflecting upon Roman religion. One sees both its grandeur and its pragmatism. It was a system designed less to probe questions of ultimate truth than to maintain harmony between humans and the divine. It demanded correctness, respect, and tradition, not necessarily personal belief or inner conviction. Yet within this framework, Romans found meaning, community, and reassurance. Their gods were ever present, their rituals ever demanded, their festivals ever. Religion was life, and life was religion, intertwined in ways that left no aspect of society untouched. If the Romans devoted so much of their lives to work, duty, and religion, it is easy to imagine them burdened constantly by seriousness. Yet this is only part of the truth. For woven into the fabric of Roman life was a vibrant culture of leisure, entertainment, and the arts. It was a society that believed deeply in otium, the time away from labor, as essential to both body and mind. Leisure, for the Romans, was not simply idleness, but a space in which one could cultivate pleasure, friendship, and even virtue. To walk through Rome, whether in the bustling forum or the shaded porticos of a villa, was to see a people as dedicated to enjoyment as to duty. No feature of Roman leisure looms larger in our imagination than the spectacles of the amphitheater. The Colosseum, towering with its arches and tiers, was the most famous of these arenas, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. Here, gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and staged naval battles thrilled the crowds. To the Romans, these events were more than bloods. They were affirmations of power, the empire's ability to control both men and nature, to turn war into spectacle, to fuse violence with entertainment. Gladiators themselves, though often slaves or prisoners of war, could rise to celebrity status, their images etched on lamps, walls, and mosaics. The crowd cheered, groaned, and shouted, united in the theater of death. For an ordinary Roman, attending the games was not a rare privilege, but a regular part of life. For the state often funded these spectacles, providing free admission as a way of keeping the people content. Yet not all Roman leisure was so bloody. The theater was another beloved form of entertainment. where comedies and tragedies were staged before enthusiastic audiences. Roman playwrights like Plautus and Terence filled the stage with witty dialogue, stock characters, and humorous plots that poked fun at social norms. These performances were not confined to an elite audience. Ordinary Romans crowded into the theaters, laughing at the antics of clever slaves, pompous masters, and scheming lovers. Tragedies, often adapted from Greek originals, brought a more solemn tone, though they, too, carried moral lessons and emotional depth. To sit in a Roman theatre was to share in the joys and sorrows of stories that, though staged, reflected the rhythms of everyday life. Chariot racing, perhaps the most popular of all Roman entertainments, brought the roar of excitement to the Circus Maximus. This immense stadium, capable of seating more than 200,000 spectators, was the beating heart of Roman popular culture. Factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, inspired passionate loyalty. Much like modern sports teams, families, neighbors, and entire districts aligned themselves with these racing teams, their identities bound up in victories and defeats. The thunder of horses' hooves, the crack of whips, and the cheers of the crowd filled the air as chariots sped around the track at breakneck speed. Crashes were frequent, often fatal, and the drama of risk only heightened the thrill. It was here, more than in the solemn temples or political assemblies, that the pulse of Rome's common people could be felt most vividly. Beyond the public spectacles, leisure also took quieter, more personal forms. Wealthy Romans, in particular, cultivated the pleasures of the villa. These country estates, set amidst gardens, fountains, and orchards, offered respite from the noise and heat of the city. Here, one might stroll along colonnaded walkways, recite poetry beneath vine-draped trellises, or dine outdoors as the evening light faded into dusk. The villa was not merely a retreat, but a stage for cultured leisure. Guests were entertained with conversation, music, and philosophy. Banquets, with their carefully arranged courses of fish, game, fruits, and wines, blended refinement with indulgence. The dining room, or triclinium, became a theatre of its own, with reclining couches arranged for comfort, and slaves attending to every need. The banquet was as much about display as about sustenance, a performance of wealth, tastes, and hospitality. For those without estates, leisure often meant the tavern or the bathhouse. Taverns offered food, drink, and social company, though they carried a reputation for rowdiness and vice. Bathhouses, on the other hand, were central to Roman daily life. These complexes were not merely places to wash, but centers of relaxation and community. For a modest fee, anyone could enter, enjoying pools of varying temperatures, massage rooms, exercise courtyards, and even libraries. The Thermae, or Great Imperial Baths, were architectural wonders, their vaulted ceilings and marble halls echoing with conversation and laughter. Men and women, though typically separated by time or space, both enjoyed the pleasures of the bath. To soak in warm water, to sweat in the steam room, to emerge refreshed. These were simple pleasures that bound all classes together. The bathhouse was democracy in action, a place where senator and shopkeeper alike might shed their togas and enjoy the same. Relaxation, music and poetry played a constant role in leisure. The lyre, flute, and drum accompanied banquets and festivals, while poets recited verses that mingled personal passion with universal themes. Rome inherited much from Greece in this domain, yet gave it its own flavor. Poets like Horace, Ovid, and Virgil were not mere entertainers but cultural touchstones. their works studied and memorized by generations. Yet poetry was not only the domain of the famous. Ordinary Romans carved verses into walls, scribbled love poems on tablets, and sang songs in the taverns. Music and verse accompanied labor, worship, and celebration alike, proving that leisure in Rome was never far from art. Philosophy, too, found its place in Roman leisure. For the educated elite, hours were spent reading, writing, and debating ideas that ranged from the practical to the profound. Stoicism, with its call for virtue, self-control, and harmony with nature, found wide appeal among senators and emperors alike. Epicureanism, emphasizing moderation and the pursuit of pleasure without excess, spoke to those seeking balance in turbulent times. To read philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a guide for life, shaping how Romans approached fortune, suffering, and death. In this, one sees leisure not as escape, but as cultivation, the sharpening of mind and spirit. Children, too, had their own forms of leisure, playing games with balls, hoops, or knucklebones. Dolls, often made of wood or ivory, provided companionship for young girls, while boys raced with toy chariots or engaged in mock battles. These games, though playful, mirrored the larger culture, preparing children for the roles and values expected of them as adults. Even play, in Rome, was a rehearsal for duty, though it carried with it the same laughter and joy familiar to children in every age. Leisure was also a means of weaving community. Festivals, games, and banquets brought people together across divides of wealth and class. To attend a chariot race or gladiatorial match was to share in collective excitement, to feel oneself part of a larger whole. To recline at a banquet was to reaffirm bonds of friendship and loyalty. Even the bathhouse, with its mingling of classes, created a space where Romans could meet, converse, and relax as equals. In this sense, leisure was never purely individual. It was always social, always tied to the fabric of community life. Yet leisure, like all things in Rome, had its hierarchies. The wealthy enjoyed libraries, gardens, and art collections, commissioning frescoes and sculptures to adorn their homes. The poor, in contrast, found their pleasures in street performers, taverns, and public festivals. Still, the line was not absolute. Free spectacles in the amphitheater or Circus Maximus ensured that even the poorest citizen could experience grandeur. Leisure in Rome was both a reflection of inequality and a counterbalance to it, offering moments where all might share in beauty, excitement, or laughter. The arts themselves were deeply entwined with leisure. Frescoes adorned the walls of homes, depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or still lifes of fruits and flowers. Mosaics decorated floors with intricate designs, sometimes humorous, sometimes solemn. Sculpture, borrowing from Greek models, filled gardens and courtyards with gods, heroes, and portraits. Art was not confined to galleries or temples, but woven into daily. To recline in a Roman triclinium was to do so beneath painted ceilings and walls, alive with color, surrounded by objects that blended function and beauty. Leisure in such spaces was as much about aesthetic pleasure as about social or bodily relaxation to modern eyes. Some Roman leisure appears contradictory. How could a people who delighted in philosophy and poetry also cheer at the death of gladiators? How could a society so refined in its art and architecture revel in bloodsport? Yet for the Romans, there was no contradiction. Leisure encompassed both the brutal and the beautiful, the intellectual and the visceral. It was all part of the human experience. and Rome, in its vastness, embraced it all. To be Roman was to read Virgil in the morning, bathe at noon, cheer at the circus in the afternoon, and recline at a banquet in the evening. Life was a mosaic of pleasures, each piece different, yet together forming a picture of fullness in this blend of spectacle. Art and reflection, one sees the heart of Roman leisure. It was never simply escape from duty, but a complement to it. To work, to worship, to fight, these were Roman obligations. To rest, to laugh, to create, these were Roman rights. The balance of labor and leisure, of duty and pleasure, defined not only the daily rhythms of Rome, but its enduring spirit. No matter how filled with labor, religion, or leisure, every Roman life was shadowed by one certainty: death. In a world without modern medicine, where illness could sweep through a household in days, where war and childbirth claimed countless lives, mortality was never far from thought. The daily rhythms of Rome were built on a deep awareness that life was fragile, and that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. To walk the streets of Rome was to see reminders of this truth in every direction. For tombs lined the roads leading into the city, their inscriptions whispering stories of those who had lived and were gone. For ordinary Romans, funerary practices began swiftly after death. The body, washed and dressed in its finest garments, was laid out in the home. Family and friends gathered to mourn, their cries filling the rooms, their faces veiled in grief. Women often led the lamentations, tearing their hair, beating their breasts, or chanting elegies that spoke of loss and memory. Death was not a quiet, private affair, but a public event, spilling into the streets as funeral processions carried the deceased through the city. Musicians played mournful tunes. Actors sometimes donned masks to represent the ancestors of the family, and torchbearers lit the path. For even in grief, Romans looked to connect death with continuity, each burial a link in the chain of generations. Cremation was the dominant practice for much of Rome's history, the flames consuming the body, reducing flesh and bone to ash. These remains were gathered carefully, placed in urns, and stored in family tombs or columbaria, communal resting places where niches held row upon row of urns. In later centuries, burial became more common, with the dead interred beneath stone slabs or within catacombs carved into the earth. Whether cremated or buried, the dead were honored with inscriptions, epitaphs carved into stone that spoke of virtues, achievements, or simple love. Some epitaphs were grand, proclaiming wealth or political success. Others were heartbreakingly modest, recording only a name and a hope to be remembered. The Romans did not imagine death as final oblivion. Ancestors were believed to retain a presence among the living, watching, guiding, and requiring honor. Shrines to the household spirits, the Lares and Pinates, ensured that the dead remained part of daily life, their protection invoked at meals, births, and marriages. Festivals like the Parentalia brought families to the graves of their kin, where offerings of food, wine, and flowers were left, binding the living and the dead in an unbroken circle of remembrance. In these practices, we glimpse a people for whom mortality was not merely an end, but a passage into continuity, where each life joined the countless lives before it in sustaining the family and the city. Still, the awareness of death infused Roman culture with urgency. The poets and philosophers often wrote of life's brevity, urging their readers to seize the day, to cherish pleasure, to find virtue while time remained. Carpe diem, Horace advised, not as idle hedonism, but as recognition that tomorrow was uncertain, that joy must be grasped in the moment, to recline at a banquet, to watch the chariots thunder around the Circus Maximus, to listen to a lover's whispered verse. These were not frivolities, but answers to mortality. In their celebrations of life, the Romans revealed their awareness of its limits. This awareness shaped not only individuals, but the city itself. Rome was filled with monuments, temples, and public works designed to outlast human lifespans, to inscribe memory into stone. Emperors raised arches proclaiming their victories. Senators funded baths and theaters that bore their names. Families built mausoleums along the Appian Way so that every passerby might read their epitaphs. In a sense, the city itself became a vast memory, a place where the dead lived on in marble, inscription, and ritual. To walk through Rome was to walk among the voices of the departed, their words carved into walls, their likenesses cast in bronze, their presence felt in every stone. For the poor, of course, such monuments were beyond reach. Their dead were often laid in mass graves or modest tombs, their names lost to history. Yet even here, the bonds of family and community ensured that memory endured, if only for a generation or two. A humble clay lamp, a wooden toy, a scrap of verse scrawled on plaster. These remnants tell us that even the lowliest Romans sought to leave a trace of themselves, however faint. In this striving for remembrance, the poor and the powerful shared the same desire to resist oblivion, to be remembered as more than dust. Death, however, was not always solemn. Inscriptions on some tombs reveal humor, wit, even defiance. One epitaph might warn the passerby not to disturb the peace of the dead. Another might joke that the deceased now sleeps soundly, free from debt collectors or nagging spouses. Such epitaphs remind us that Romans faced mortality not only with fear or reverence, but also with irony. Humor was its own kind of resistance, a way of mocking the inevitability of death, of asserting humanity in the face of fate. If daily life in Rome was defined by labor, leisure, and religion, it was bound together by this ever-present shadow of mortality. To live as a Roman was to balance work with worship, pleasure with duty, and always to do so under the awareness that time was short. Yet it was this very awareness that lent Roman life its intensity. The grandeur of the amphitheater, the elegance of a banquet, the intimacy of a prayer whispered at a household shrine, all took on meaning because they were fleeting. Life, the Romans understood, was precious precisely because it ended. As we look back across the centuries, it is easy to be dazzled by Rome's monuments, its emperors, its legions, its vast empire. Yet beneath that grandeur lies the true heartbeat of Roman civilization, the daily lives of its people. The woman grinding grain before dawn, the senator debating philosophy at his villa, the child playing with a wooden toy in a dusty courtyard, the crowd roaring as chariots sped by. These are the moments that defined Rome. They remind us that behind every triumphal arch and marble column were lives lived in work, in joy, in faith, and in sorrow in the end. What daily life was really like in ancient Rome was not so different from our own. It was filled with struggle and aspiration, with laughter and tears, with routines that seem ordinary and yet, when viewed through the lens of history, shimmer with meaning. The Romans lived under harsher conditions than we do, their lives more precarious, their comforts fewer. But they sought the same things we seek: security, community, pleasure, meaning, and remembrance. Their world was distant, yet their humanity is close, and so, As the lamps were extinguished at night, as the fires in the hearths burned low, as the hum of the city quieted into sleep, each Roman, rich or poor, free or enslaved, carried with them the same hope, that their labors had mattered, that their prayers had been heard, that their pleasures had been savored, and that their memory might endure. In that, they are not so far from us. For in the small details of their days, in the weaving of their lives between toil and leisure, faith and mortality, the Romans revealed not only who they were, but who we are. Their empire has long since crumbled. Their monuments, though broken, still stand. But the true legacy of Rome lies in the rhythm of its people's lives, fragile, fleeting, yet eternal in memory.